Pues empezamos con Ana Busquets, Alemany, de la Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, que va a presentar una ponencia, el papel de los intérpretes en la primera embajada franciscana a China, 1579. Gracias, Ana. Te escuchamos.
Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias. I will speak in Spanish. So I have used a lot of manuscript sources that you can read. Please apologize because my talk will be in Spanish, but later we can discuss in English and I will try to do my best, so thank you very much. Agradezco la invitación en primer lugar a Guillaume, a Paola también, que la saludo, una lástima no haber coincidido, y también, como no, a Alex. Como comentaba, siempre es un placer encontrar a buenos colegas y conocer a colegas nuevos, por lo tanto, muchísimas gracias por impulsarlo y por hacerlo. Yo he cogido un caso de estudio, me interesaba, quizás es un poco tangencial con el tema, pero creo que sí que habrá elementos para encontrar puntos en común, que es el papel que jugaron los intérpretes, esas figuras que actuaron en las mediaciones y que actuaron en los contactos entre unos y otros y que con frecuencia han quedado muy ocultados en las propias fuentes. Es decir, sabemos muy poquita cosa de estos agentes que intervinieron, cómo lo hicieron y de qué manera actuaron. En concreto, he elegido una embajada que llegó a China en 1579, es decir, en la segunda mitad del siglo XVI, y que es una embajada que también es importante tener el contexto, puesto que se realiza en contra del gobernador de China, de Filipinas, perdón, que no autorizaba la embajada, y también contra las leyes en esos momentos o los dictámenes que había en China que prohibían la entrada de los extranjeros. Por lo tanto, es una embajada que ya nace con unas características muy concretas y que luego condiciona esa mediación que realiza, en este caso, varios chinos. Y remarco que son plurales, es decir, que también es una de las ideas importantes a tener en cuenta, el número de personas, de agentes que mediarán en cada uno de los contactos. Los vaivenes de esta embajada quedan recogidos fundamentalmente en 3 manuscritos que son 3 de los protagonistas que viajaron en esta expedición, 2 religiosos que son Alfaro y Tordesillas y un soldado que es Dueñas. Estos 3 manuscritos están transcritos en un proyecto que se realizó en esta universidad en el que participaban la doctora Folk, el doctor Ollé, y que están disponibles online, colgados en la página web de esta universidad, como puede verse en estos pantallazos. Y los originales se conservan en el Archivo General de Indias, que es el de Alfaro, y el de Tordesillas y el de Francisco Dueñas se conserva el original en el archivo de la Real Academia de la Historia en Madrid. Los 3 documentos son la base de mi comunicación, que empezaré resumiendo muy brevemente cómo fue esta embajada y que a continuación me interesará poner el énfasis, los objetivos serán en estas preguntas fundamentalmente. ¿Quiénes eran estos intérpretes y qué conocíamos de ellos? Esta gente que hacía de mediación, ¿de dónde procedían? ¿Se sabe cómo aprendieron la lengua castellana y qué nivel tenían de castellano? ¿Era la única lengua de mediación que utilizaban o utilizaban alguna otra para la mediación? Y otras 2 cuestiones también, como son qué tareas realizaban, es decir, en qué tipo de mediación actuaron y también hasta qué punto daban pruebas de fidelidad en esa mediación, es decir, hasta qué punto era una mediación totalmente objetiva, si se me permite, o no. En cualquier caso, es un trabajo de ir rastreando la poquita información que hay en los manuscritos para dar identidad a estas voces, es decir, para resituarlas en estos contactos interculturales y, sobre todo, añadirlos a esos análisis que han centrado el foco en el tipo de informaciones que proporcionaban sobre los contactos o sobre el país. Es decir, que complementa, creo, perfectamente otros trabajos que existen, sin ir más lejos, del propio doctor Ollé de esta universidad. Bien, empiezo la primera parte de manera muy rapidísima, situando esta embajada. Esta embajada, los franciscanos la ejecutan en 1579, es decir, un año después de haber llegado a las Islas Filipinas y siguiendo las instrucciones que ya se habían dado a Legazpi de salvar a las almas de los infieles que habitaban en el país vecino, es decir, salvar a China. Y por lo tanto, esta es la misión, y a mí me gusta una de las frases que Tordesillas indica en su manuscrito, y cito textualmente, dice: después de la sobremesa tomábamos por deporte el tratar las cosas de China. Es decir, era la costumbre, ¿no?, hablar de China, y también el propio Alfaro, que es el que también hará la expedición a China, muestra desde el primer momento en su manuscrito: nuestro principal intento, cito textualmente, con que veníamos a estas partes era si pudiésemos pasar al gran reino de la China. Por lo tanto, este era el intento. Como decía hace un momento, el gobernador Sande se opuso de todas a conceder la licencia que era necesaria para pasar al país vecino. Es decir, que Sande, que era conocido como el doctor Sangre por su rigor en todos los castigos y en toda la gestión que hacía, refusa autorizar esta embajada, en primer lugar porque los chinos tenían prohibida la entrada de extranjeros, y en esto llevaba razón el gobernador, es decir, ahí acertaba completamente. En segundo lugar, y aquí ya empieza la figura del mediador, del intérprete necesario, porque los chinos de Manila, que eran los que tenían que viajar con la expedición de castellanos, se habrían negado a realizar la expedición, y aquí también iba acertado el gobernador, es decir, no se equivocaba en que los chinos, los sangleyes, tendrían miedo a las represalias, conocedores de su propia cultura y su propio país, de las represalias que ello les repercutiría. Y en tercer lugar, por el hecho de que no se fiaba de los chinos. Y aquí sí que, por un lado, se acordaba de embajadas previas como la de Martín de Rada, que habían sido abandonados en una isla por el grupo de chinos que los dirigía, pero también se mezcla aquí el odio que tenía profundamente Sande a los chinos, que los llama desde idólatras, somitas, ladrones, corsarios, es decir, en cualquier caso, menos cualquier adjetivo bueno, les dice de todo. En cualquier caso, la embajada, los franciscanos, avalados por los decretos papales que habían salido y que parecía que habría China a las órdenes mendicantes, se lanzan, y la expedición zarpa del norte de la isla de las Filipinas y se dirige justo hacia el sur de China, que es donde entran, y aquí ya empezamos a encontrar, ¿no?, en los documentos, la primera información que me interesa. En esta expedición que viaja a China, de acuerdo con estos tres relatos que he trabajado, viajaban 4 religiosos, 2 de ellos, Alfaro y Tordesillas, son los que dejan los relatos. De Juan Bautista y Sebastián de San Francisco no se ha encontrado o no se ha conservado ningún manuscrito, y estos van con la tarea de evangelizar directamente. Y aquí he puesto este grabado que a mí me gusta mucho de la conquista de las Islas Filipinas, que ejemplifica claramente, ¿no?, el brazo armado y el brazo religioso de la llegada a las Filipinas para luego conquistar China. 3 soldados viajaban, de los cuales se ha conservado la relación de Francisco Dueñas, un preso, que era un chino, que es el que cogieron preso y obligado de Manila para hacer de intérprete, y luego llevaban 4 indios filipinos que especifican eran los que hacían directamente la tarea de remar durante la trayectoria. Se dirigen a China, llegan a la zona de Cantón, son trasladados a Chongqing, hay unas entrevistas con los virreyes, pero como veremos a continuación, por múltiples incidentes y malentendidos en las mediaciones realizadas a través del chino / chinos que intervendrán en la embajada son finalmente expulsados del país. Pedro Alfaro, que había liderado la expedición, regresa a Macao, mientras que el resto del grupo, con Tordesillas y Dueñas, regresan a Manila. ¿De acuerdo? Por lo tanto, este es el contexto. ¿Qué pasa? Y lo he presentado de manera muy sucinta. ¿Qué pasa con este tipo de trabajos o de mediaciones en las que me he interesado? Si nos fijamos en la parte lingüística de lo que son las Indias occidentales, hay bastantes trabajos, es decir, hay trabajos como los de Martinel Solano o una tesis bastante reciente, cada vez es menos reciente porque es del 2005, pero de Iciar, que es Intérpretes de Indias, la mediación lingüística y cultural en los viajes de exploración y conquista Antillas, Caribe y Golfo de México. Es decir, en el caso de las Indias occidentales son abundantes, los trabajos son minoritarios, no menos buenos, también es verdad. En el caso de las Indias orientales existen los trabajos de Clotter, los trabajos, por ejemplo, recientemente de una investigadora de Lausanne, de Victoria Vegeland, que ha trabajado también aspectos similares a los que en los que yo me he centrado estos días. Por lo tanto, me interesa el papel de mediación entre castellanos y chinos, y un primer elemento que me ha interesado es saber cuántos son, quiénes eran y de dónde venían. En el cuántos, si hacemos un recuento de las maneras o de las veces que en los 3 manuscritos que he trabajado, son manuscritos, en un caso tiene una veintena de folios y en los otros no llega a los 10 folios, es decir, un poco también para situar la dimensión de estos manuscritos. Pero en cualquier caso, Fray Tordesillas es el que más veces utiliza la palabra intérprete o ladino, es decir, 55 y 3 veces, es decir, de manera recurrente trabaja y explica los problemas, sobre todo, que tendrá con la mediación lingüística y también mediación cultural que harán estos agentes. Alfaro únicamente 2 veces y Francisco Dueñas, que es el soldado, también únicamente una vez. Las palabras que utilizan fundamentalmente son la de intérprete, ladino y, en un caso que es el caso de Pedro Alfaro, nahuatato, que seguramente es una importación del contexto americano y, por lo tanto...
Es una palabra náhuatl.
Náhuatl, exacto. Y, por lo tanto, la incorporan en este manuscrito. Bien, ¿cuál es la información que nos viene de estos, o que nos da de quiénes eran? El único que apunta a algunos detalles de estos intérpretes es Pedro de Alfaro. Y Pedro de Alfaro señala 2 cosas. Por un lado, un intérprete que es Juanico, el sangley que traíamos por intérprete, y el otro que dice el traidor de Simón, nuestro intérprete. Por lo tanto, son pocos los datos que nos da. El hecho de que utilice el Juanico podría deberse a que seguramente era una persona joven, y en ambos casos son nombres bíblicos, con lo cual nos da que pensar, o relacionados con la cultura cristiana, nos da que pensar que seguramente podían ser chinos conversos, pero más allá de esta información no tenemos más datos. ¿Qué sabemos de la procedencia de estos intérpretes según la información de estos manuscritos? Por un lado, el hecho de que eran sangleyes de Manila, es decir, eran los chinos que venían de Manila y que habían podido aprender la lengua castellana ya en las Filipinas. Me gusta mucho a mí la expresión de Bosson, no sé si lo pronuncio bien, que él habla de Manila en esos momentos como una ciudad, como un laboratorio lingüístico, es decir, como realmente un pool en el que las lenguas de los naturales y de los recién llegados se entremezclaban, y que era el sitio donde se aprendía. Aquí también me gusta recordar lo que John Will señalaba en su obra China and Maritime Europe, el hecho de que durante sobre todo el siglo XVI y XVII los aspectos de la mediación cultural e intercultural y lingüística eran una especialidad china, es decir, él habla de una especialidad marítima china, puesto que es verdad que, y sobre todo en estos primeros momentos, eran muchos más los sangleyes que eran capaces de hablar castellano / portugués que no los religiosos, que serán capaces de tener unas ciertas habilidades lingüísticas y competencias comunicativas en chino. Otro grupo Otra procedencia de estos chinos que harán de intérpretes son los chinos cristianos de Macao. Y esto será importante porque a lo largo de esta expedición franciscana china veremos cómo algunos de estos intérpretes hablarán más portugués que español. Es decir, será el portugués la lengua franca incluso con los castellanos, que son los que están realizando la embajada. En tercer lugar, lo he comentado antes, algunos chinos esclavos y también algunos esclavos negros cafres procedentes también de los portugueses. ¿Cómo actuaban estos intérpretes? Es decir, estos intérpretes actuaban, y aquí quiero hacer un paréntesis, señalaban primero o eran importantes para interpretar los códigos culturales del mundo chino, es decir, eran los que facilitaban la entrada a los códigos que era necesario respetar para la propia embajada. Evidentemente, no se escapa, garantizaban la comunicación oral. Y luego también, de acuerdo con los manuscritos, facilitaban, según en qué coyunturas, explicaciones, por ejemplo, ante una visita al virrey, de los protocolos que era necesario seguir. Por lo tanto, resiguiendo nuevamente los manuscritos, en este caso, por ejemplo, en el mediador para la comunicación oral, son recurrentes las frases, él he seleccionado dos, ¿no? Llegándonos a él, al chino, le preguntamos por nuestro intérprete dónde iba, es decir, que todas las preguntas las tenían que canalizar evidentemente a través del intérprete, o preguntónos el juez por el intérprete, a través del intérprete, de qué nación éramos, dijimos que éramos castellanos. O lo que señalaba hace un momento, la figura del intérprete como mediador para interpretar los códigos y los códigos culturales, y los protocolos chinos, tanto para interpretar los diferentes contextos. Llegó a nosotros un chino que hablaba portugués y preguntónos qué buscábamos. Él nos dijo que no le podíamos hablar al gobernador sin un intérprete, más que nos llevaría a casa de uno. Es decir, el intérprete busca a otro intérprete para poder realizar la embajada, o ningún intérprete puede hablar con ningún extranjero sino el que haya sido nombrado, salvo si lo llama la justicia. Es decir, nuevamente este intérprete les hace de canal, de vía de entrada para hallar el otro intérprete al cual tienen que dirigirse. También, por ejemplo, en el protocolo de tener que arrodillarse ante los mandarines y por lo tanto hablar arrodillados, o no lo he añadido aquí, pero también, por ejemplo, en el protocolo de tener que ir en sillas, es decir, que esto alarmaba a los franciscanos y era la costumbre de China, por lo tanto, el tener que ser portados en las sillas propias de los mandarines. Otra de las funciones era la de facilitar, evidentemente, los aspectos logísticos, la movilidad en un imperio en el que tenían prohibida la entrada, y por lo tanto el facilitarles, dice el manuscrito, unas letras negras grandes en el cual venía escrita la licencia, el permiso del gobernador de la provincia para poder moverse, y evidentemente sin perder de vista que eran religiosos, para celebrar los sacramentos, ya fuera los bautizos, ya fuera la predicación, ya fuera el celebrar una misa. Y en este caso les facilitaban algunos espacios como la cita, pues en casa del chino intérprete. Y finalmente, otra de las funciones a las que ayudaban estos intérpretes, de acuerdo con estos tres manuscritos, es la de facilitar las redes con los diferentes estamentos de las zonas en las que aparecían. Y por lo tanto, aquí el intérprete nos dio mensajero para que fuese a Macán, al cual nuestro hermano acomodó, etcétera, etcétera. Por lo tanto, estas serían las funciones que los tres manuscritos recogen de estas figuras. ¿Qué sucedía en el día a día, es decir, en la práctica, en el devenir de esta embajada que, repito, se había hecho contra las leyes chinas y contra la ordenanza de Sande? Por un lado, queda clarísimo a lo largo de los tres documentos la doble cara que jugarán estos intérpretes. En primer lugar, al servicio de los castellanos, y en segundo lugar, al servicio de los chinos, y podríamos apurar al servicio de ellos mismos, porque, como digo a continuación, o como señalo a continuación, acabarán tergiversando los mensajes, es decir, acabarán modificando la comunicación ya fuera por codicia, ya fuera por corrupción o ya fuera por miedo a los castigos que les podía representar el hecho de estar ejerciendo de intérpretes sin la autorización del gobernador de la zona. Se sabe que los castigos derivados de la intrusión de los extranjeros podían ir desde los azotes hasta la pena de muerte para los intérpretes, y por ello jugaban siempre en este tergiversar los mensajes. Y es curioso, en una de las, luego lo veremos, en uno de los manuscritos, el religioso de una manera muy graciosa dice, bueno, y lo hacían tan bien, que es que disimulaban tan bien que nos engañaban a todos como tontos, es decir, que nosotros pensábamos que nos ayudaban. Dice, incluso le regalamos un cáliz de plata, es decir, que le daban lo poco que tenían y estaban tergiversando por completo los mensajes. De aquí se derivarán, de este doble juego de los intérpretes, se derivarán incluso situaciones tensas, no solo para los castellanos, que a priori es la conclusión inmediata que todos tenemos, sino también entre los propios intérpretes. Entre ellos habrá rencillas, es decir, se pelearán por esta codicia o esta corrupción o este miedo. Incluso Tordesillas dice, sucedió que otro día se armó una rencilla entre los dos intérpretes, diciendo el uno al otro que le habían dado mucho plata por piedra. Es decir, que esto genera disputa entre ellos y también genera el efecto de corregirse uno al otro, seguramente para salvar el pellejo. Es decir, uno corrige al otro, no, yo he dicho la verdad, el otro es el que está traduciendo falsamente. Y ahí también el juego de esta mediación. ¿Cuáles son las palabras o los verbos que en esas 55 veces que aparece la palabra intérprete, por ejemplo, se vinculan a estas figuras? Pues fundamentalmente todos negativos, desde fingir, nos entretuvo, cohechó, trocó, falseó, engañó. Es decir, todos son palabras que vislumbran y muestran, ejemplifican de qué manera este intérprete modifica, ¿no?, la mediación lingüística a realizar en favor de su propio beneficio, ¿no? Y aquí a la izquierda pues hay varios de estos ejemplos a los que me refiero. En conclusión, los intérpretes de esta embajada son considerados traidores, la embajada es un fracaso y los franciscanos son expulsados y acaban siendo nombrados o definidos como gente codiciosa, ladrones y que nos tenían vendidos. Es decir, hasta el punto de que Alfaro se exclama y dice, el intérprete, el hijo de Satanás, de tal manera nos engañaba, falseaba y daba allá sus preguntas y respuestas, que diciendo nosotros unos, él decía lo otro. Es decir, que a cada uno decía lo que quería. Para terminar con mi intervención, sí que me gustaría señalar algunas reflexiones que creo que son interesantes. En primer lugar, el hecho de pluralizar y el hecho de hablar de intérpretes en plural. Es decir, las figuras del intérprete variaron bien por el tema idiomático, es decir, intérpretes que pudieran hablar más de una lengua, bien por un tema coyuntural, intérpretes específicos para ir delante del juez, intérpretes específicos para explicar el protocolo cultural. Por lo tanto, me parece interesante este primer apunte. El segundo, los intérpretes como puente lingüístico. Y aquí, nuevamente, yo me he focalizado en la parte oral, en la parte lingüística, la comunicación oral. Hay otra parte que también en estos tres documentos no se alarga mucho, pero en otros del mismo siglo sí, que es puente lingüístico / escrito, y es la traducción, la parte esta de la mediación que va vinculada a esos informes y cartas que sirven para manejarse y que también sirve para dar respuesta a esos contactos. También son traducidas, también son hechas por estos chinos sangleyes y por lo tanto también es un elemento a explorar en trabajos de este tipo. El tercer tema, intérpretes como puentes culturales. Ya me he referido a ello, entre la aproximación a ciertos protocolos, la aproximación a la comprensión de, por ejemplo, las jerarquías en el mundo chino, el funcionamiento propio de las instituciones y, por lo tanto, estos agentes como mediadores en los códigos culturales. El otro elemento, el de las fidelidades, de las traducciones y de las traiciones, tanto orales como escritas, porque también en el aparato escrito las traducciones podían ser modificadas en beneficio de esos mediadores. Nos falta, y esto pues quizá ir a futuros trabajos, futuros manuscritos nos darán pistas, nos falta mucha información sobre, por ejemplo, la metodología del aprendizaje del castellano, es decir, cómo aprendían estos chinos el castellano. Había un método establecido, seguramente, y ahí también tenemos pistas, los que hablaban portugués, los que procedían de Macao, les era mucho más fácil aprender el castellano, pero en cualquier caso, de qué manera estos chinos aprendían la lengua que después les servía para hacer esa mediación, también es un elemento en el que nos falta información. Y finalmente, para acabar, la figura de estos intérpretes, que yo no me he atrevido a poner intérpretes ineficaces, pero en este caso resultaron a ser así, porque eran intérpretes que no ayudaron en absoluto a la expedición y, en cambio, y es paradójico, si bien fueron traidores y son llamados traidores, son estos mismos intérpretes los que ayudan a aprender chino a esos mismos misioneros. A partir de ese aprendizaje son los religiosos los que luego harán estas mediaciones. Por lo tanto, este elemento también, ¿no? Se critica la labor de estos chinos intérpretes, pero en cambio se justifica el utilizarlos y usarlos para el aprendizaje de la lengua china y para que facilite esas mediaciones entre la comunidad castellana y la comunidad china. Muchísimas gracias. Espero haberme ceñido a los 20 minutos.
Gracias, Ana.
Gracias. Hacemos unas...
¿Al
al final mejor.
Sí.
Yo creo que sí, mejor, ¿no? Así podemos
Colectar
colectar también preguntas de los colegas que están online.
Muy bien.
Así que...
Pardon, c'est moi ¿cómo se dice? Y donc c'est José Miguel ahora. Pongo un poco de francés para la diversidad lingüística. C'est José Michel, voilà. Joseph Michel. José Miguel. José Miguel, ¿tienes una presentación?
Sí, la están acabando ahora.
Ok, pues José Miguel Escribano PAEZ de la Universidad Pablo de Olavide en Sevilla va a presentar una ponencia en inglés, entonces.
En inglés, en castellano, como prefiráis.
Creo que en inglés a Pierre-Emmanuel le viene mejor.
Sí, yo la podría hacer en francés, porque mi francés es casi tan malo como el inglés.
No.
La diferencia es que por el francés todavía guardo un respeto que ya perdí hace tiempo por el inglés.
Eso es una razón. Es decir,
Sí, es una...
¿Cuál es el que quieres?
Es DIPLOMACIA.
Sí, te había... Este es nuevo, te lo había...
Entonces, a ver, ¿cómo hacemos para...?
Pues tenéis título aquí. Sería en español Diplomacia de playa, ¿eso?
Sí, diplomacia de playa o diplomacia playera. Esta referencia así,
Sí.
A ver, ¿dónde estás?
Sobre
aquí,
las islas
aquí se comparte.
Molucas.
¿Dónde lo comparte? Aquí, ¿verdad? Sí.
A finales del siglo XVI, principios del XVII.
Si posem tota la pantalla, potser, i després...
Posem tota la pantalla, por si...
Aquí,
Aquí.
sí, i comparteix, i comparteix. No, has de posar aquí, ara comparteix, i ara ja posem la presentació.
Aquí estás presentando, sí.
Aquí.
Okay.
Perfecto.
Vale, pues...
Te escuchamos.
Pásale el diapo,
Sí, pot ser.
Perfecte. Moltes gràcies. Well, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to present part of the preliminary results of my ongoing research on violence escalation and violence restraint in early modern Maluku. I want to start with a quote from Leonard Andaya, from his authoritative work on early modern Maluku, in which Leonard Andaya states that in the art of diplomacy, as in the art of war, the Malucans proved to be excellent students of the Europeans. This statement will trigger some ringing alarms nowadays, but it can be easy to understand why this expert, I mean, he's the reference, everybody working on early modern Maluku has to refer to his work. Well, by the time this work was written, the history of cross-cultural diplomacy was in its fancy, but unfortunately there has been little advances in this field in comparison to the history of other cross-cultural diplomatic interactions, such as the negotiations between the Iberians and several other powers in Southeast Asia and Southeast China Sea. We know very well the diplomatic negotiations between the Portuguese, the Spanish with the Chinese. We have just attended to a wonderful presentation on that, the Japanese authorities. We know also very well the diplomatic interactions between the Spanish and the main sultanates from southern Philippine archipelago, and the same can be said about the Portuguese Malacca with the sultanates of Aceh, Johor, and so on. This is not to say that there are no works on the diplomatic interactions in early modern Maluku. For instance, Antonio Lobato, who composed his PhD on the Portuguese presence, paid attention to it, and actually it wrote a chapter on this subject in a general volume on the history of the Portuguese in Indonesia. But even in this work, I mean, it pays much more attention to the violence, and despite of offering some sporadic glimpses on diplomacy, but this diplomatic activity is much more focused on Malacca rather than on Ternate and Maluku. There are good reasons for this. I mean, the Maluku scenario is notorious for the huge amounts of violence. Any kind of violence you can imagine it's present there, from colonial violence to massacres, rebels, I mean, whatever. In my ongoing research project, I pay attention to diplomacy precisely because this extreme amount of violence, and which role these diplomatic interactions could play in explaining this violence escalation, but also the other part, the violence restraint. Well, in my presentation, I will try to argue first that early modern Maluku hosted a vibrant diplomatic activity. Second, that by no means the Malucans followed an external diplomatic model, or better to say, a European diplomatic model. On the contrary, the foreigners were forced to adapt their diplomatic practices to the Malucan codes. And third, and strictly connected with this second point, the clearest proof of this is the paramount importance of this low-intensity diplomacy between different communities. That's the reason why I really celebrate the idea of the organizers of this event to focus on this low-intensity diplomacy between different communities, because I think this is crucial for bringing diplomacy back in the analysis of Malucan and Iberian interactions. For the sake of clarity, I will not cover all the diplomatic negotiations between Malucans and Iberians. I will focus in the general framework of the last decades, 16th century, and more specifically in some negotiations taking place in the mid-1580s. You can see here a very basic chronological framework, I mean, from the arrival of the Portuguese in the early 16th century, very basically, they gained a privileged position in Ternate politics. They were allowed to build a fortress to defend their claims against other European competitors, namely the Spanish. But in 1575, they lost that privileged position because, well, the assassination of Sultan Haroun triggered a violent reaction from his heir, Sultan Babula, who expelled the Portuguese from that fortress and for the island. They got refuge in the traditional rival of Ternate, Tidore, that other main sultanate from Maluku. You can see it in the map there. And, well, this status quo fell into pieces when the Iberian Union allowed for the counterattack of the Spanish. No? From the 1560s, the Spanish had been much more focused on Manila and the Philippines. Of course, the main diplomatic adventure of the Spanish was China. The Maluku was only popular to certain sectors in Manila and not always very, very popular, let's say. Anyways, during the 1580s, there were several expeditions led by the Spanish trying to gain access to the cloves trade by allegedly helping the Portuguese to recover the fortress. I mean, all the diplomatic interactions going on here has to do with, first, the access to the cloves trade, second, the recovery of this fortress. The issue is that for the very beginning, the Maluku proved a difficult scenario for the imperial diplomacy, organized either from Goa, Manila, Mexico City, Lisbon, Seville. No, I brought here just one example. These are the reference to an embassy in the political communication between Goa and Lisbon, and indeed, Don Duarte de Meneses, the Viceroy of the Portuguese Empire, informed Philip II about his decision to send an ambassador to Ternate in order to negotiate with the Sultan Babula the return of the fortress to the Portuguese. The Spanish king approved that move, as you can see it here, but shortly after, and even despite his initial optimism, Don Duarte de Meneses was a bit pessimistic about Artur de Brito's performance. No? In November 1587, he shared his skepticism, saying, well, esperas este ano por Artur de Brito, que ainda que escreveu novas do cachorro, no cuido trairá máis escravo que os outros. And shortly after, this pessimism proved true when Don João de Silva wrote about the arrival of this news that, well, estes que vêm põem culpa a Artur de Brito no proceder da sua embajada. The next reference to this embassy in the political communication between Goa and Lisbon already tell us about the complete failure of the embassy. We can blame Artur de Brito for his poor performance as an ambassador. No, after all, the first commitment of an ambassador is to survive in his mission. He failed. Thanks to Diogo do Couto, the Portuguese chronicler, who had access to some direct sources, even if he did not mention openly that in their account, had his own version of this failure. According to Diogo do Couto, this embassy failed because Artur de Brito followed the instructions he has been given in Goa. He received a certain amount of presents to be delivered through the Sultan of Ternate, only on the condition of a formal return of the fortress. Interestingly, the members of the Portuguese community present in Maluku advised Artur de Brito to forget about these instructions and deliver the presents without waiting for any formal return of the fortress. The thing is that, according to Couto, this fact of not adhering to the usual practice or the Malucan diplomatic culture provoked the anger of the Sultan. In fact, shortly after, this Sultan mandó lanzar un pregao que todos os portugueses que fosem a Ternate descalzasen na praia os sapatos so pena de ser presos. The Portuguese could stay like other merchants communities, but with this degrading condition. I don't know if you have found similar examples to this specific protocol. It's a bit intriguing for me. There is this first example of this failure of adhering to this Malucan diplomatic culture, and this connects with the next slide I want to share with you, that tell us about the complex or the rich etiquette of this Malucan diplomacy. This is an example that comes from the report from Cristóbal de Salvatierra, made about the ongoing negotiations between the Sultan of Ternate, the Sultan of Tidore, in the framework of the Spanish attempts to conquer Ternate, and these ongoing negotiations on, well, whether to return the fortress or not. In a certain moment, the Sultan of Ternate sent a letter, and this Spanish friar provided us with a detailed description of this letter. These descriptions allows us to connect the Malucan diplomatic etiquette with some others from the Indian Ocean, like in the uses of these silken envelopes, and also very interesting, this reference of the scent of the letter. No? Reminds us to the use of olfactangs in the Deccan courtly culture that some other sources tell us about in the framework of the Portuguese negotiation in Goa with the Said Salah Sultanate, the Mughals, and so on and so on. So they had an etiquette. Let's see how the Spanish, who had just entered into the scene, adopt to that. This is the letter the governor of the Philippines sent to the Sultan of Ternate. Since the letter is in Paris, I cannot consult the letter directly, so I cannot tell you if it smells to rose water or not. Yeah, he has much to learn about from the Biblioteca de Ayuda. But well, the materiality is completely different. Yes, of course, it is also written in Castilian paper like the previous one, but this is a very interesting document, let's say. Well, in it, the governor makes use of this stick and carrot diplomacy. On the one hand, he threatens the Sultan of Ternate. On the other hand, he offers a good reason to obey. There's this threat so obvious, ¿no? Pues de lo postrero del mundo envía a sus capitanes a estas partes y siempre han sido vencedores de grandes reinos y provincias, de creer que no habrá resistencia en sola esa pequeña isla. Spoiler, there was resistance. Second, the island was not alone. The content of the letter did not adapt either to the uses or the etiquette of the Southeast Asian diplomatic culture that we know very well thanks to the works of Annabel Gallop. There is no mention at all to the delivery of presents and all the formulas or the salutation, the insa. This letter is all the opposite of the usual epistolography any ruler from the Southeast Asia will expect to receive. There is another instance of the Spanish performance in this diplomatic scenario. No? We have seen that they were not very good in this epistolography. Let's see how they interacted in the in the arena of the political conversation. No? We have here an instance of a meeting of one of the envoys of the Sultan of Ternate, engaging in a conversation with, making an offer to the Sultan of Tidore, remember, an ally of the Portuguese and the Spanish. And this Sultan takes time to respond, something that provokes the anger of this Spanish captain, who, again, makes this comparison with Philip II, ¿no? Habló muy alto y airado diciendo que el rey de España era el mayor rey que había en el mundo y que cuando le hablaban sus capitanes que luego respondía y que no estaba como él repatingado con su barrigaza y ojos de cabra mirando para una parte y a otra. Even Salvatierra and the rest of the captain's presence were able to see, okay, this is not the kind of etiquette. It's a huge mistake because we know, thanks to the work from Andaya and other anthropologists, that the Moluccan political cultures pay a lot of importance to the oratory. And the silences, these paused speeches, again, second failure. What's the main the problem here? That it's not also a poor performance of the Spanish or these Portuguese embassies. The problem is that there were other diplomatic actors on the stage. No? We know, thanks to several sources, that there was at least 4 or 5 different merchants communities with a stable presence in Maluku, the Portuguese, who were by no means the most important ones, the Chinese, the Javanese, and let's note, also very important, the Ottomans. No? We know very little about the Chinese presence in 16th century Maluku, even despite the excellent work by Wang Mianshu, because it focused more on a later period. And the Iberian sources pay much more attention to the Javanese and the Ottoman presence in Maluku. I think you hear one example of how the Spanish sources refer to this. It makes reference to the impact of a diplomatic gift by these Ottomans. I already discussed that gift in an article published some years ago, and it became a success. I mean, it had been translated into Indonesia, and it has made its way to some websites of the Indonesian Wikipedia. No? It's very, you never know which parts of your work will attract more attention. Why is this reference important? Because we know that by this time, the Ottomans present there were not part of an official attempt to extend Ottoman authority there. They were not official ambassadors. They had no connections with the Ottoman politics. No? The analysis of the Ottoman documentation carried out by Giancarlo Casale years ago has unearthed the available materials on the diplomatic activity of the Ottoman Sultan's representatives in Southeast Asia, but this says that, well, that activity came to an end in the late 1560s. And after the death of Sekolu Mehmed Pasad in 1579, the central government has no direct involvement in the Indian Ocean trade. No? That's the reason this example fits so well in this workshop on communal or diplomacy from below stage from these different communities. I'm running out of time, so I will move forward. Maybe we can come back later to the different moves from this community, trying to secure a safe place in the case of formal recovery of this fortress by the Iberian authorities. We have some sources referring to how these Ottoman merchants tried to negotiate their status as non-combatants vis-a-vis the Spanish, the Portuguese. And we know that the Javanese did the same. But I want to call your attention on a fact that I think is important because it allows us to bring the spatial dimension of this low-intensity diplomacy that has to do with the space these communities occupy. Now, there are these Spanish sources that mentions the specific place where these Ottomans and these Javanese lived while at the city of Gamelame, is the capital city of Ternate. He mentioned that they are placed next to a bulwark in a palisade, and unfortunately, even if we don't have some representations of Ternate in this period, we can identify the space in the first drawing from the Dutch. No, you can see the main mosque on the left, then the fortress with the tower that was the place of residence of the Sultan of Ternate, and then on the other left this structure. It's a bit unclear. It's more clear in this other representation, again, after, from the first travel of the Dutch here. The bulwark, it refers, I think, is this building here. It conserves part of the wall. There is another example, this drawing from 1601. Again, we can see the structure, the defensive structure. And it's interesting because it is clearly a European defensive structure, so I think it captures well the sense of a space that is in which these foreign communities replace each other. The next representation, already after the Dutch settlement, includes the defensive structure, but it has completely disappeared. And I think what is really interesting for me from this spatial dimension is that I think it captures the place these foreign communities occupy in Malucan politics. They are present in the main city, Gamelame, but they are out of the central space. I would like to hear your reflections later on this fact. No? What is this? No? It's a sort of Eastern example of the Mediterranean fondue, but I think that it captures very well this notion of this community that also is placed next to a defensive structure. No? This is something to guarantee the protection of these foreigners, or is a way of controlling these foreigners. No? I'm thinking here about the Sanglays in Manila. No? They are placed under the main fortress. Anyways, the Spanish, the Portuguese try to secure a place in Ternate, but they were not asking for a place in this peripheral settlement. No, they were asking for the main space. No, they were asking for the recovery of the fortress with all these implications. The fact that these communities occupy a peripheral space in the landscape of this capital could lead us to think that, well, they occupy also a peripheral space in the Malucan diplomacy or in the Malucan politics. But that was not the case, in which, and here I'm running out of time, but I will try to extend it very, very, very briefly. Because we know, thanks to the Portuguese and the Spanish sources, that the Spanish attempts to negotiate the surrender of the delivery came to a dead end precisely because the Sultans of Ternate wanted to respect some of the agreements they had with the Ottomans and the Javanese merchants. There was a very detailed negotiation on who has to pay for the artillery these communities has provided, who can return, who can get this artillery, and so on and so on. And even at a certain moment, the Spanish even offer an economic compensation to these communities, but with no result. The Spanish attempts to conquer Ternate came to a sound failure, also because of these divisions between the Spanish and the Portuguese, but that's a completely different story, that's interrelated, that could be also help us to gain a more accurate knowledge on this complex inner workings of this community low-intensity diplomacy. But for now, I only want you to bring all this to certain conclusions. No? I think that the Iberians failed in their attempts to obtain their objectives by diplomatic means. There is no doubt about it. At the same moment, when other communities were succeeding thanks to this low-intensity diplomacy. This also has to do with, let's say, the structural constraints. Not these communities fitted better in the Ternatan agenda. They perform better and accordingly to the local diplomatic culture, and they also stayed in and out of the political arena in a moment in which the Iberians proved unable to do so. I'm 5 minutes late, so I will leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hear your comments, suggestions, questions, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pues voy a presentar a Pierre-Emmanuel Bachelet. Es maître de conférences, es decir, profesor titular en la Escuela Normal Superiore de Lyon y puedo deciros también que recientemente, hace 2 años, publicó un libro sacado de su tesis de doctorado que se titulaba Bateau, pigeon et quartier japonais. En español sería Navios Palomas, ¿puede ser? Barrios japoneses, una microhistoria regional de las relaciones entre Japón, Daviet y el Champa, finales del siglo XVI, principios del siglo XVIII. Y hoy va a presentar una ponencia, tenéis el título en la pantalla. Gracias, Pierre-Emmanuel.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, and sorry I will be speaking in English as you know. Thank you very much for Alexandre for the organization of this, for hosting this event, and thank you again to Guillaume GAUDIN and Alexandre for the invitation, the organization of this workshop. So this is the first time I really work on the topic of diplomacy. This is the first time I really think about diplomacy. In my book, thank you, you already introduced it, but I'm doing a little bit of auto-promo. Sorry about that. I had a chapter on diplomacy, so the third chapter, where I questioned the relationships between Japan and early modern Vietnam, present-day Vietnam powers, where I considered the role of what I call the merchant diplomats. The question I raised were actually the same as the ones we are raising here, like the same question raised by the new diplomatic history as well, such as the non-state actors, the materiality of exchange, the interactions other than just official meetings between actors, etc. And this kind of perspective, actually, we find it in many books of many recent books and works adopted this kind of perspective. But what strikes me the most in this kind of books and research is that the diplomatic encounters are always between Westerners and non-Western powers and actors. We have actually very few analysis of inter-Asian encounters, diplomatic encounters. We do find this kind of perspective in recent Asian language scholarship. For example, in this book, which is called The Diplomacy Woven by the Official Letters, Kokushoga Subugaiko in Japanese. So this book shares the same interest as the new diplomatic history and our interest. It focuses on non-state actors and especially on the materiality of the diplomatic encounters, on the letters in particular. This is the title. One kind of specific inter-Asian relation was thoroughly investigated, though it is the tribute system, the Chinese tribute system, of course, such as the work by David Kang. But here I would like to switch to another perspective. I'd like to shed light on inter-Asian diplomacy in a context of relatively horizontal relationships. I say relatively because for the states, their interlocutor was not necessarily seen as a same-level partner, and the tributary view of the international relation was still very important for these actors. To this picture, I'd like to add another point of discussion, which is the question of trust building. Trust is a notion that is commonly seen, used as a valid notion in historical anthropological research, but it is at the same time rejected by a great number of economists who deny the relevance of the notion. Trust for these economists is seen as nothing more than an empty word that could be replaced by calculation. For example, Oliver Williamson said that replace the notion of trust by calculativeness, and he thinks that we don't need notions of social capital to study economic exchange. I completely disagree with him about that point, but I think that it's quite interesting to discuss the relevance of this notion of trust. As for myself, I used several times the word trust, and actually I don't have any definitive ideas about how to use it and if we should use it or not. I'm completely open to discuss it. But I think that we should remain a little bit cautious, especially with the sources I am using. So unless all sources directly say, I trust this person, I trust these people, I think quite difficult to observe, to see trust in the sources. What we can observe and analyze, though, are the strategies deployed by the actors to look trustworthy, to reach mutual agreements, to build a reputation, etc. All these strategies can be summed up under another notion, the notion of credibility, which has been chosen by many historians, social scientists, as an alternative to trust, or they use both of the terms together. Therefore, the building of credibility would be a strategy, a process through which the actors of diplomatic encounters would write and act so as to be seen as trustworthy, to be acknowledged as legitimate. Whether they ultimately succeed in gaining the other's trust in this context of rare and fragmentary sources is not that important, actually. It's less important than their strategies and the competitive advantage they could have or they could lack. In this way, we could get a picture of how the actors involved in diplomatic state-to-state encounters build credibility. These notions of trust and credibility are actually not very frequently used in the context of diplomacy. This recent book in French tried to do it, but in my opinion, in quite an unconvincing way. In this book, there is little reflection about the notion of trust in itself. The book is rather a collection of various, very interesting, but just a collection of examples, in my opinion. So, to give some context about the diplomatic encounters I am discussing today, I'm interested in Japanese diplomacy, early modern Japanese diplomacy. And there are three main periods that we can divide. So the first one would be from the late 16th century, when the Japanese government and the Japanese lords, the daimyo, started to write letters, to send envoys to open official relations with Southeast Asian powers, first with Manila, and later on with Siam, present-day Vietnam, Patani, Cambodia, etc. The second phase would be when there is an implementation of a system of trading licenses in Japan. It corresponded with the opening of diplomatic relationships with the country where Japan-based traders went to trade. And these relations were more or less successful depending on the country. After the 1630s and the prohibition of maritime travel in Japan, these diplomatic relations became less and less frequent, and the shogunate no longer took the initiative to contact its former partners. In the meantime, however, some Japanese living in Southeast Asia still kept diplomatic functions, especially between the Europeans and the local powers. The Japanese therefore played a very important role as diplomatic actors in various situations in this long 17th century. Most of them were actually traders before all. Even when they were sent by the shogunate, they were not seen as what we could call diplomats from the European perspective. They were go-between, they were intermediaries, sometimes they could occupy specific function, but they were not the emanation of the sovereign or the state they would represent, although they could have the same role as people who would. So we have a kind of diplomacy without diplomats in a situation in which trade is the most important topic, more than foreign policy, diplomacy, as we may think about it in the first place. So situation in which the mutual position of the participants is not always very clear, can be contested, can be negotiated. So the main question is what these Japanese and their partners did to be considered as legitimate, and did they succeed? Did they need to be charged with occupiable functions to be regarded as trustworthy? Did they need to be the official representative in some way of their country of origin? And as Japanese, could they be considered legitimate enough to represent another country? I'll answer this question through several case studies aiming at illustrating the diversity of the roles and strategies of these actors. The first one would be the connection between Japan and the southern Vietnamese state of Nguyen. The Nguyen were the main partners of early modern Japan in the early 17th century. They exchanged around 30 letters, documents in general, between 1601 and 1635. And these letters shed light on the strategies used by officials to gain their trust and to look credible, legitimate themselves. So the first strategy will be a writing strategy. So Vietnamese lords and Japanese shoguns and their ministers use many references to Chinese classics, such as quotations of Confucius or Mencius, quotations of Tang Chinese poetry, these kind of things. And it was a way to show their erudition, to acknowledge that they shared a common education, sometimes also to flatter the other one's erudition. These references are obviously not used in the correspondence between Japan and Siam or Cambodia, because the authorities of these countries did not share this knowledge. They needed to go through a translation of letters, for example. And this is one of the main aspects that gave a competitive advantage to the Vietnamese territories in their relations with Japan. Another important strategy is the choice of gifts, presents. Most of the presents sent by Vietnamese lords included raw silk fabrics, which were Japan's most important importation item at that time. And regarding the presents and also the moment of the exchange of presents, we have a very valuable source, which is this scroll, this 17th century scroll depicting the travel of a Japanese merchant to the Nguyen realm, and which is currently held in a temple in Nagoya, the Jomyoji. So we see the moment of the meeting with the Lord. We can see the Japanese trader offering presents. And in this situation, of course, the role of the presents is to show the ability to provide its partner with the most adequate gifts and to enhance the prestige of the sender by the quality of the gifts. One of these gifts is particularly interesting. This is the Kimmabako betel box in Japanese, which shows the high level of knowledge of local norms by foreigners like the Japanese. Betel, as you may know, was offered during every meeting with someone in Southeast Asia. And in this case, it was clearly a non-Japanese custom that was adopted by Japanese merchants. We were talking about adaptation just before, so it is really interesting. It shows that the Japanese knew how to adapt to local social norms, and it was probably one of the key features in their success. Although this is the only example of this kind, this document is from Japan. There is no reason to think that the Japanese would invent this kind of detail. A last very interesting instance of adaptation comes up when you look at the titles used in the letters. What is striking is that each side used a title adapted from the letter received just before. The Tokugawa shoguns, who almost never took the initiative to write letters, used the sophisticated title that the Vietnamese lord took in their own letters. But the title used by the shogun was so simple that the Vietnamese lord had to be a little bit more inventive. So to ensure that diplomatic and trading relations would be successful, he resolved to be modest and did not take any risk by calling the shogun King of Japan. The Vietnamese lord therefore used the vocabulary of the tributary system, where king is a title given by the Chinese emperor to the sovereign of the tributary state. The Vietnamese kingdom had its own king, so it logically puts the Vietnamese lord in a lower position than the shogun. And it was actually the best strategy because in the Chinese perspective of international relations, it puts the shogun in the right place as the ruler of his country. Even though the Tokugawa eventually refused to be integrated into the Chinese world order, at this time this decision was not yet made in the early 17th century. And when it came to state-to-state relations with a Southeast Asian power that previously had no relations with Japan, this was probably a good compromise on the Japanese part. This question of how to name the partner was so important that it played an important role in the success of the relations between Japan and the southern Vietnamese realm, but impeded the relations between Japan and the northern Vietnamese realm. This realm was ruled by the Qing family, who used the title of king for themselves while writing to Japan, but never used the title King of Japan to address the shogun, which, associated with another faux pas, lead the Japanese authorities to strictly stop answering the Qing lord. It is unclear, it is maybe doubtful that the Qing lord did this mistake on purpose. Actually, they called the shogun by the title of shogun. This is really interesting. Probably because they knew that it was a title that was correct, because they knew that it was the official title of the shogun. But a title that was adequate in domestic policy in Japan is not necessarily adequate in foreign relations. And if the Qing lord used the title of king for himself, but the title of shogun for the shogun, he established a vertical relationship between him and the shogun that could not be accepted in Japan. Finally, the building of credibility was also a process that took place outside of the meeting hall and the time of the exchange of letters. We have another scroll from the 18th century. It shows other scenes taking place during the stay of the envoy, such as entertainment. We see here an animal fight showed to the Japanese trader. For the Vietnamese lord, it was a way of enhancing his own position, but also to treat the envoy in the most lavish way possible. So now I would like to switch to the envoys themselves. In the South Asian-Japan diplomatic relationship, the Japanese who held diplomatic functions were crucial, but they were not specifically appointed to this kind of office. So the letters I mentioned just before were carried by the main actor of Japanese trade with the Nguyen realm at the beginning, Funamoto Yashichiro, whose activities preceded the diplomatic relations. So he was given diplomatic function because he had already strong connections with Vietnam. And in 1619, due to the constant trouble provoked by the Japanese on the spot, he was appointed as responsible for the activities of the other Japanese. As you can see, a wooden board was put in the port to make known to every Japanese that this guy was their responsible. That is the only case where the Japanese authorities appointed an individual with a specific representative function, although this function does not really correspond to a diplomatic function. The word used, hakaretsuki, is not really clear, according to Japanese historiography as well. But obviously, he's not an ambassador of the shogun, he's not an official representative of the Japanese state. But since he was transmitting the letters, he also had unofficial diplomatic functions. A different and more frequent case is that of Japanese traders used by Southeast Asian authorities as their representative to open diplomatic relations with Japan. One famous example is Yamada Nagamasa, who was probably the most famous Southeast Asian Japanese, who became the head of the Japanese community in Ayutthaya, in Siam, and a minister of the Siamese king. The Siamese sent a few embassies to Japan, which were actually received by the shogun. The first one was in 1621, and Yamada, as the head of the Japanese, became the main go-between in these relationships. He didn't travel himself, but wrote letters to the shogun's ministers. As you can see, the content is more straightforward than many letters sent by the Vietnamese. The actor's sole motivation was clearly trade before any matter related to diplomatic intercourse. We also see that the Japanese trader puts forward his trading interests. And at the same time, the establishment of trade seemed to need a diplomatic protocol to be fruitful. We have, unfortunately, few information about the envoys, the actual so-called diplomats, but it looks that the representative of the Siamese king, the individuals who embodied the Siamese state, were Thai, had to be Thai. The Japanese envoy was probably just here as an interpreter. In the case of Nagamasa's letters, to build credibility, it was important to respect the protocol and to show respect. This is why this letter was addressed not to the shogun, but to the shogun's minister, Doi Toshikatsu, so not to the shogun himself. In Cambodia as well, we see a Japanese envoy to the Japanese authorities, but this time for matters more closely related to diplomacy than to trade. This is a very rare example. So this is Taketomi Nagaemon, who brought a letter to the Nagasaki governor asking the Japanese authorities not to support Siam in the conflict of Siam with Cambodia. It is really doubtful that the matter was ever brought before the shogun, but this is testimony that Southeast Asian authorities also used locally established Japanese for their official relations with Japan. So we see that the main strategy to gain credibility from the Southeast Asian rulers is to mobilize the Japanese subjects, something the Japanese couldn't do as there were no Vietnamese, Thai, or Cambodian settled in Japan. So the asymmetry in the structure of the exchanges led to an asymmetry in the strategies of confidence building. After 1635, when the Japanese living in Southeast Asia were no longer allowed to go to Japan, there was still punctually diplomatic envoys in Japan. There were Vietnamese, there were Thai, etc. We have, unfortunately, no information about their official status, how they were regarded by Japanese authorities. Maybe they were regarded as envoys carrying tribute, similarly to Korean envoys at the same time. In any case, none of them managed to reopen regular diplomatic relations with the shogunate. So as a final part, I'd like to discuss the role of several Japanese who settled in Southeast Asia and occupied several diplomatic functions. Most of them are actually mentioned in European sources, which explains why their role as go-between with the Europeans is the most visible. So Ursula was one of these go-between. She is mentioned in the first two journals written by the Dutch in present-day northern Vietnam in 1637-1638, when, coming from Japan, they tried to take advantage of the Japanese prohibition of sea travel to replace the Japanese in this country. So as soon as they arrived, they were taken care of by a Japanese called Guandono, who played the role of interpreter with local authorities. He also provided other services, such as hosting the Dutch in his own house. But he was soon replaced by another go-between whose role would be even more crucial, Ursula, who was a Japanese, or maybe a Japanese of Korean descent, or maybe a Korean, that's not clear. These people were not diplomats. It does not seem that they were officially invested with specific functions by local powers. They did not represent Japan, but neither did they represent the Qing state. Their function was at best informal. And at the same time, their role was crucial because there were nobody else to do what they did. They had a competitive advantage, linguistic and social. The Dutch were coming from Japan, and the only language they could communicate through in this country was Japanese. So the Japanese were natural go-between. This is why I did this figure. This figure is focused on the variable of communication, and it shows that when you take communication as the criteria, the interpreters are, of course, in the center of the relations, which is not the case when you just take the sources. If you take the sources, you have the impression that the Dutch are at the center of the relations, but here, of course, the interpreters are. So these go-betweens form an apparently very effective network spread around the main places of foreign trade in northern Vietnam, and they allocated specific roles to each other. Ursula's role was to attend all the meetings between the Dutch traders and the Qing lord. Her role was not limited to communication. She also helped the Dutch comply with local protocols, such as carrying their official letter under a parasol. And quite surprisingly, nothing is said about trade and Ursula. This is one of the only examples of a Japanese with diplomatic function not getting involved, apparently, in business activities. She had her own agenda, however, because in one Jesuit source, she's said to have taken the Jesuit side, blaming the Dutch for trying to harm the missionaries. So she also had a kind of double game. So how did Ursula do to look reliable? Actually, the Dutch insisted on what they did themselves to look reliable. So the first thing they did, they offered a gift to Ursula, which was a Japanese cloth. And Ursula seemed to have already a strong foothold on the spot and a very strong connection with local authorities, and it was probably enough to make her reliable. So this question of reliability is extremely important in their specific context, because this is on this topic that the Dutch diary ends. The Dutch indeed complained about the Japanese, but on the trading part of the relations. At first, they refused to let the Japanese help them in the transaction because they didn't trust them. The word trust is, and trust in Dutch, opdrage, is used. So we know that this is about trust. Finally, they ended up relying on the Japanese all the same for one transaction, and the Japanese cheated them. So what we can learn from this episode is that the foreign traders had to rely on go-betweens to conduct diplomacy, but did not rely on them for trading purposes. Well, they did their best to avoid using them. But even if the Japanese did not look reliable, the Dutch, being stuck in a marginal position, eventually chose to give them a fraction of their cargo to conduct business. So this is the kind of examples that demonstrates that trust, when you can read it, is not that important where you are in a dominated position. You do what you can do in your position. So in this example, we could join the economists by saying that the Dutch made a calculation to make the best of the situation despite the difficulties, and they obviously miscalculated and failed. So maybe it was 25 minutes. Okay. So the question I wanted to raise here dealt with how to reach an agreement in the context of state-to-state relations. Who were the actors involved? How did they succeed or fail? A first factor of success was obviously what we could call a cultural proximity. The Vietnamese and the Japanese spoke or read the same written language, which was Chinese, not only as a language, but also as a system of common references, intellectual references and values. And surely for the Japanese state, exchanging letters full of references to the Chinese classics with foreign partners enhanced the prestige and the legitimacy of these partners. But the cultural proximity was not everything. For example, the Qing and the Nguyen were both close to Japan in terms of models of how to conduct diplomatic relationships, but the Nguyen succeeded because they accepted to be regarded as an inferior partner in the context of, as I called, relatively horizontal relations. So the key to success was also find its place into a world order based on hierarchy. And we shouldn't overestimate the role of cultural connivance, because if so, how to explain that Siam was almost as important as Vietnam as a diplomatic and trading partner? Supplying the right resources for the Japanese market was also a key aspect in the success of state-to-state relations, of course. In this case, the question of credibility lies elsewhere. It is the reliability of responding to the demand in Japan with an adequate supply of goods. It depended as much on Japanese and local traders as on officials. That is why the Japanese traders were entrusted with diplomatic functions. Analyzing the role of gifts is a good way to reconcile all these aspects, because presenting the most adequate gifts had multiple functions: show the adequate respect to the partner, enhancing its own legitimacy through well-chosen gifts, show the partner that you know what kind of presents would best suit them, anticipate their needs and desires, and show that the country you represent or whose behalf you are traveling can supply the goods that are sought for in the host country. Because the gifts, the objects of diplomacy are often, although not always, objects of trade. So finally, I'd highlight the difference between trust on one part and credibility or reliability, which are very close in my opinion, and why trust is maybe less relevant. When a diplomatic actor arrives in the host country, he has to rely on someone, to find someone that could help him access the highest authorities and perhaps help conduct business. And this actor had to look reliable himself in front of his potential partner. Then, thanks to strategies of credibility building, the multiple actors of this exchange have to reach an agreement, which is always related to trade, or they fail to do so. In the end, what room is there for trust as long as an agreement is made? Well, actually, trust is still there. Trust is there. It remains as an individual feeling, a consideration about the possibility of fulfilling the terms of the contract of our agreement. However, as I already mentioned before, as long as the actors are not directly exposing how they feel about the agreement or about the partner, as it is with this kind of sources, it seems almost impossible to identify trust as an actual driving force in diplomatic and trading relationship in the 7th century's China Seas. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Okay, so we're done. We're almost done. We now can proceed with questions.
We leave the place for them.
Actually,
For
yes.
the
Well,
microphone.
I think we can stay here and then because
Because of the people at home,
yeah.
it's better if you can stay.
because they are watching us. So, but the thing is, well, let me see. I can now just make this. Well, what happened? Oops. Oh man.
For all the people.
I can. I can.
Porque luego hay un micrófono en la sala para todos, ¿o qué?
I don't think so.
We have one. Yeah, we have this one.
Okay.
Let me see if I can fix this. Hopefully.
Yo dejo mi sitio, ¿no? Para que puedan hablar aquí, ¿no?
No te gusta estar aquí, yo ya lo veo. Bueno, pues ya bajamos. Bajamos ahí.
Con su colección se puede quedar.
Hi, Birgit. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hola.
¿Y los otros tienen que volver a conectarse?
Sí.
¿O?
I think so.
Igual están conectados donde antes, Alex. Es muy raro que estés sola, sí, ¿no? ¿Estás conectado a la mateixa sesión?
Sí, en teoría sí, 14.
Vale.
Es 14, no hay, sí, pero ostras, a ver.
¿Y seguro que se han enviado a la invitación?
No, porque están aquí, están todos conectados, deberían estar en el... Lo que pasa es que, claro, no sé yo si han... No, lo que pasa es que como... Sí, no sé qué ha pasado. Supongo que se irán conectando. Sí. Bueno, no sé quién quiere empezar. Si queréis preguntar en inglés, en castellano, in English, in French. Una pregunta, tú, Ana, pues.
I would like English. If not, my colleagues can help me. Thank you very much for the talks given by my colleagues. I was wondering when listening your presentation, in one of your analysis, you have talked about the titles, no? If they said as a king or as a... And I was wondering if, related to the linguistic questions, you have found some words, and I am looking to Brigitte because she has studied this very well. Looking if you have find some words that the different sides, the same word has been interpreted in the different way in the encounters. I don't know if I am explaining the question, but I was wondering if you have find some of these, or an example of this, or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I don't think so, because they wrote in the same language, which is Chinese, with some Vietnamesisms and Japanisms, but they wrote in the same language. And I think between the Japanese and the Vietnamese, the understanding was quite clear. There was some the misunderstanding came out with protocols and cultural differences, but not in the language, I think.
For example, in Spanish, we have, no, and I also make reference to Brigitte, no? In some letters we have the word amigo, o amigablemente, no? Friendly, friendship, and the interpretation from the Chinese side and from the Spanish side is completely different. The use of the word and the interpretation of this word, because in Spanish side is interpreted in an equal relation. But from the Chinese side, instead of using amigo, it's clear that the emperor or the governor is always, no, in a hierarchical position.
Because
my question was in this kind of
okay, but in this context, you have to go through translation with the Chinese and the Spanish. So translation of amigo into a Chinese word. So this is why you lose something. And in the Chinese letters between Vietnam and Japan, you don't have this kind of problem, but you have other problem of, for example, these are very specific things, but when a letter you finish a column and you start a new column, this can have some meaning about the importance of the people, of the word, which word you finish the column with. And there were some misunderstanding between the Vietnamese and Japanese around this kind of things, this kind of formal rules. In the linguistic, I'm going to think about it, but here now I don't think about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Probably because I mentioned.
Brigitte has a question, but maybe ladies first. Okay, so Brigitte, go ahead.
Thank you, and hello or good evening to everyone. I'm very sorry that I missed the presentation, so in that sense a bit strange that I come straight with a question, but just wanted to follow up on Anna's point, and since you mentioned sorry for the echo. The formalities of this written communication. I have been wondering, are there any examples of what is the use of the blanks? I've done some work on that, that the Japanese and the Chinese tradition, in order to express respect or politeness, you have a lot of blanks you use blanks in diplomatic correspondence. Do you find this in your sources? And do you find also certain difference depending on which other ruler is addressed?
Yeah, thank you. This is what I just mentioned actually when I told that there was some misunderstandings about finishing a column and starting a new one. This has something to do with blanks also, because you put a blank after the title of the general. So it was seen as something respectful on one side and not respectful on the other side. So yeah, you have this kind of things, right? But on blanks, specifically on blanks, I have a few examples of letters with blanks, and I don't remember if this has something to do with respect, but maybe I should probably get back to these documents. The thing is, most of my corpus had been edited, so when it was edited, the blanks were not included. So I have some handwritten document and some edited, and maybe we lost this kind of details in the edited editions.
It's possible, yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you, the three of you, for the presentations. And I was really interested in, I think that it worked really well, the panel, in the sense that you all talk about really suggestive ideas. And in all the presentations, I was surprised by something that was connecting them and that you didn't place into the center. That is the sensoriality and the sensoriality of all these low diplomacy, supposedly. So, Anna, I wanted to ask you, and especially you talk actually in relation with the orality, where are the descriptions about the orality? We have Samuel Bermejo, for example, had talked about the descriptions of how in the Consejos de Estado, the description of all this idea of how it's pronounced and is important. In the same way, when I was listening to José Miguel, I was thinking a lot about the descriptions of all these kind of sensibilities in it. So you were talking about the protocol of being descalzo in the beach, and I found it really interesting, the description, because it talks directly about an image that is being generated by the sources, isn't it? So in that sense, I wanted to know how do you place all this in your research? In your analysis, for example, of the material culture, how this sensoriality works. And in relation with your presentation, I found it also really interesting to which extent you were talking about, they are using the same kind of, they are using the same language, but sensibility and sensoriality is culturally defined, isn't it? So do you find some kind of sources or points that could give us a bit more? Because if we are talking about practices of diplomacy, we had to recenter all these kind of discussions about sense, isn't it? About voices, about touch, all these kind of things. I mean, I don't know if you have ideas. I mean, it's just for opening the discussion.
I think it's all. I think it's also what you were saying, and it's connected to my concern about diplomacy, which is very connected to what you said about trust. I think this is a very anthropological or ethnographical issue that sometimes you think that most of these low diplomats or even the missionaries who went out there working as diplomats, they were ethnographers, in fact, and they were having all these sometimes connections to the extent that most of them were considered as relatives to most of the communities they were. And this idea about connectedness and this idea about proximity, and which is the same as when we talk about trust, I think it's fundamental. I mean, I totally agree with you that trust should be should prevail when we talk about this kind of diplomacy, because I think it's in many of the talks that you guys were giving us today. I mean, the idea about trust, I think, is fundamental, because most of these people who were actually working as diplomats, when we talk about how they were engaged with the communities, I mean, when there was no violence, like when José Miguel was talking about the Moluccas, violence was prevailing. I think trust was fundamental. I mean, I would certainly defend this notion as a very anthropological one, and probably that's the thing that to what extent trust and diplomacy are connected in a sort of anthropological way or ethnographical way.
Okay, thank you. That's two big questions, I think. So as for the question about orality, the thing is, in the relations between Japan and Vietnam, it's very, very specific, because we have people that can read each other but cannot speak to each other, because they use the Chinese as a writing system, but they don't speak Chinese with each other. They speak their own languages. So when I was showing the scroll, we can, I forgot to mention it was really important, but you had three people in the interview. You have the Japanese trader, the Vietnamese lord, and someone in between who was the interpreter, of course, a local Japanese interpreting in Vietnamese. The thing is, we don't have any sources about how does it go when they were face to face and speaking. We don't know. We only have the letters. We only have the letters, so we don't know how they spoke. We just know that when a Japanese trader came on the spot, he went to meet the local Japanese who spoke Vietnamese, who was well settled in the country, and they went together to the Vietnamese lord for the official or semi-official meeting. We have more information about the orality in the relation between when we have European sources, of course. When you have European sources, we have some information. Unfortunately, the documents I used are always very. How should I say? They don't really put emphasis on how they communicate. They just said Ursula said to them that, and they responded that, and so we don't know how it was performed, how it was actually performed, and how the message could be, the communication could be obstructed or changed because of the translation. Or I'd love to see that in my sources, but I didn't.
Well, regarding this sensorial dimension, that I think it's very, very important, but I have to admit here that I'm a latecomer. And by latecomer, I mean I never paid attention to this until 3 weeks ago, when I had the chance to read the next book of George Flores that has not appeared yet, but that includes wonderful passages on the sensorial experience in this Portuguese Mogor diplomacy and the emotions sparked by this some of the materialities regarding this diplomatic setting. Very interesting book. It will appear in some weeks or some months in Pen Press. Go run and buy it. But let's bringing that to my presentation. No? The fact of this new protocol, no? Of removing your shoes while entering Ternate. At the beginning, I thought about this as a certain way of controlling this community. I don't know if you have tried, but now it's very fashionable, this mood of walking without shoes. I mean, you can walk, you can't run. But then, listening to your question, I realized there is something else. I mean, Ternate is a volcanic island. It's not a very comfortable place to walk without shoes, I think. It's, you know, this feeling when you enter into a shop or into a big mall just before the closing hour, and they do this of putting the music higher and higher and higher. I mean, they are not expelling you, but they are making sure you are uncomfortable enough for not wanting to stay there, and you move. I don't know if that is the issue at the stake here. And just a following up on Alexander's very interesting reflections on the notion of trust. I mean, I don't like this economic way of discussing notions, no, because they are so black and white. And I mean, I can understand them. At some points, when it is about a transaction, you can go away without trust. No, that's something I have discussed several times with my father, who were not alive. Making businesses without trust, or we used to associate trust with the work of Francesca Trivellato, and well, after all, what is this trust about? No, the diamond is authentic or not? It amounts this amount of money or not? We can survive or not about that. But when we are moving into a violent scenario, and when we are negotiating about restraining violence, trust is crucial, because it is about survival. And in that scenario, you cannot make a decision to throw your arms without really trusting each other. You can surrender, and you can surrender hoping the other will respect your conditions. But when it is about de-escalating, you need a lot of trust, and that's something is present in the sources. No, the Spanish and the Portuguese spend a lot of time discussing to what extent the Sultan of Ternate and above all the Sultan of Tidore, the Ali, was reliable or not. That's why I found your presentation really, really interesting.
So, about sensorial dimension, I think that in the Spanish manuscript and also in the published books, we have some descriptions. Alex mentioned that these people, merchants or soldiers or the missionaries, were ethnographers, and they keep all the information, and they explain, for example, in the case of the Sangleyes or in the case of the Chinese, the multilingual that they were, because they realized that the Chinese spoke one language in Manila that were the language from Fujianese Chinese, and they explain it and they put it on the descriptions. But when reading the manuscripts, for example, on describing the embassies or describing the expeditions, we don't find this kind of news. They only mention that we have to change the interpreter because he were not able to speak, or these kind of things. But the descriptions and the linguistic reality, both in China and Manila, were in the general descriptions. I don't know if I am explaining very well, and but it's also there is another point for me surprising, because if we think that in Spain we have the, please help me with the translation, cronista y cosmógrafo, well, how to say in English? The chronicler, the official chronicler, that was López de Velasco, no? And López de Velasco made some questionnaires, no, just to put or to highlight which kind of information, on linguistic information, the people has to pay attention. But then when they made the relations of the expedition, they forgot this kind of things. So I think that we have an ambivalent, no, I don't know how to say better, but we have two kind of informations depending on the manuscripts or depending on the documents they made.
The thing is that when you were presenting, and I was thinking, sorry. When you were presenting, and I was thinking about the work of Eberhard, or I listened some things a long time ago. So, but it was really interesting about the sound, the conception of sound, and the description. Even, for example, these interpreters, how they are described in the sense of, are they described as loud people? Are they described, because you pointed in that as how did you describe it? And exactly. So in that sense, but how is described their practice in that moment? So I look for the interpreter for translating, no? But how they describe that moment, as loud, as not. I mean, there is something of description there that can be in some way analyze it from an anthropological point of view, no? So I was pointing in that direction.
Yeah, but we don't have enough information to go on this kind of thing. Because they only, at least in the three manuscripts that I have worked on, they only criticize. So Tordesillas mentioned that one of the interpreters was Satan, no? Just because he didn't trust the interpreter. But we don't have enough information to make a general picture of these people. At least in the three documents that I have worked today. Yeah? Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much for three very interesting talks. I was going for a question for trust, but now we're talking about interpreters. So first, I'm going to ask you the question. First to comment. I think it's oftentimes the case when we perceive something as normal that it works, we don't mention it. And if it does not work, we mention it. Exactly. So every time that the interpretation works well, we know nothing about it because it's not mentioned. It's not there. It's invisible because it just works as it should work. And every time it doesn't work, there's a problem, there's a traitor, whatever there is, then we'll learn about it. So all the times that we don't learn anything about it, I think that's all the times that it really had worked out without any problem. So just wrap our minds maybe around that. The other short question, in the case that some of the interpreters have not done their job properly, you said I think there's still teachers for the friars to be teaching them Chinese, but the other question is, would they build up the trust, connecting that again, to be employed again as interpreter at some point? Or would you see them having lost that kind of trust to be never again asked to be interpreters for diplomatic missions?
I think that the needing of, because we have to, I think that the needing of use, exactly, was a kind of circle that even they know that they can trust on Chinese, they can trust on these interpreters, they have to use them. So I think that they, again and again, they find these connections with these interpreters. I don't know if maybe in Spanish I can explain better, but no, es decir, los utilizaban para el aprendizaje de la lengua, aún sabiendo de la traición, y luego los volvían a utilizar. Es decir, que al final era como una rueda perversa, sabiendo la traición que habían hecho. Exacto.
So I would like to follow up then with the other question. I think this topic of trust is very intriguing, very interesting. I can follow what you said, Alex, and you as well, José. But the question is always, as you mentioned, how can we find actual, real trust into people, between people? So I think the people really trying to find alternative concepts to really find them in the sources makes definitely sense. And I think credibility is something that's maybe more tangible than trust is. Because trust is a concept that ranges from very high trust to very low trust, but it's not really like yes or no thing. I think credibility is maybe more black and white, more easy to pinpoint. So I'm really interested to maybe follow up on that and continue talking about that. And the other thing is, one thing is, as you mentioned, trust between people. One person trusts the other person. And the other one is trust in institutions or trust in frameworks. So do I, as a person, trust the framework to protect me so that in case the transaction doesn't work out, I'm protected in some sense. So that's another kind of trust, and I think this might be easier to track and gives a total different perspectives on the matter of trust. And going away from this perspective, just a very quick question in regard to these merchant diplomats from Japan. Have you seen any change in regard to what kind of message that was transmitted, in the sense of this was a higher level diplomat, lower level diplomat? Could you pinpoint that at some point, or is it no correlation whatsoever?
I try to answer you. So your question is there any evolution actually in the status of these merchant diplomats? Okay, so we know a few of them, very few of them. For example, for what I know the best, which is the Vietnamese-Japan relations, you have one guy at the beginning and another guy from another family at the end of these 30 years. One guy and another family, guys from the same family afterwards. So there was a moment where they switched from one to another, but we don't really know why, because this guy was appointed in 1619 to supervise the Japanese. He brought a letter, and we have a blank of a few years, and after that, this is another family taking care of this business. So we don't know. Another kind of evolution we can see in these letters is that all these letters with very respecting a protocol, using classical references, being very taking care about the title they use. This is for the first letters. The letters in the first years. So when they began when they start to have diplomatic relationships. After that, we see less classical Chinese references, and we see more and more letters between ministers of the shogun rather than the shogun himself. This is, to me, something like it shows that it was normalized after 10 or 15 years, and the shogun didn't have to be the in person to be seen in person as an active diplomatic actor. I think. I don't know if I answered your questions. Okay. I didn't answer you just before, but of course, I think that this is really important to put trust in diplomacy. This is why I wanted to talk about that today.
I totally agree. I actually was a reaction a little bit provocative against what you said, because I also doesn't trust much on the concept of this calculation thing, which is, I don't think that explains.
I agree with you more than with the economist.
Yeah, I know, but. Because I think there's much more cultural issues around rather than economic ones. So I think that's what really concerns me as an anthropologist, that we should explore much more this cultural dimension around this idea about trust, that I think it's in the Mediterranean. The anthropologists, I could remember so many, were based on that, on the idea that you trust on relatives, you trust on your close friends. And of course, that's meaningful to the extent that when you are, the distance of your relatives means that you don't trust. So I think that's important, because when you are close in terms of, or for instance, when we have alliances in terms of kinship, that means that you can trust. But of course, that's not automatic. We know that sometimes I mean, when we talk about trust, that's based on what? On friendship, on kinship, or religion? Sometimes we found that many people baptize enemies and they thought, well, now they are trustful. They were not. We know many examples. For instance, Alimuddin in Manila, when he was baptized in the 18th century, when he returned to Sulu, he wrote 2 letters. One saying, welcome these guys, and the other letter in Arabic saying, kill them all, and the Spanish. So I think this is very interesting, though, to what extent when we talk about trust, I mean, it's based on what? I have my doubts that sometimes we should use this concept, but I think that definitely I don't like the other one. I mean, the calculation, or you said calculative.
Calculativeness, but this is from an economist, and I don't agree with him. So, yeah, I don't think we should reduce it to the calculation either. The thing is I am in a context, as I told you, with the sources are really fragmentary, rare, not precise, and we just have to assume that the people trust each other. So this is, just like you said, this is quite dangerous, I think. Yeah. What I tried to do in my previous research was to use the framework of the middle ground, of Richard's White middle ground, for the relation, and I didn't really think about trust in this context, but it would be very interesting to cross, I think, this perspective to see if the middle ground is what we create to produce trust or credibility in our relations, or these kind of things.
¿Puedo añadir algo? Oh, Ida, ¿tenías una pregunta?
To Ana. Bueno, un aspecto que ya se ha remarcado de esta, bueno, aparentemente contrasentido, ¿no? del intérprete que al mismo tiempo es maestro de idioma. Y otro, me ha llamado la atención, así como otra manera, la de usar la palabra, por ejemplo, nahuatl, o sea, como una conexión con otros contextos de uso necesarios de intérpretes, como es lo del contexto americano. En el caso americano y sobre todo del náhuatl, ya se ha visto que estos intérpretes acababan teniendo también una promoción social importante. En el caso de los intérpretes que nos has presentado, y maybe also in the other mediators or the other papers, podemos ver un caso de promoción social hasta el punto de realmente una consolidación de...
But yes, in other cases, for example, in Martín de Rada expedition, because Martín de Rada relies on some Chinese that we know the name of these Chinese that help on Augustinian or Franciscan or Dominican embassies, but not in the Franciscan embassies, not in this case. And back to the question of Ebu and your questions, it's paradoxical, but probably they need to use as teachers, because I was thinking now that probably most of the Chinese first learn Portuguese because of, or in Macau, or then in Philippines. So probably, no, they were the best teachers possible for the missionaries. So I think that was the needing, no, of use this Chinese. I don't have another explanation, not now, but I think that this question of the Portuguese language could help us to understand why Sangleyes, the same ones that were mentioned as traitors or so on, then were used as a teacher in the Philippines, because also there are another, or there is another explanation, that is the economic explanation. When in Philippines, these people, the Sangleyes, were people that they have to live and they have to earn some money, so they need, no, to collaborate or to help in the community.
very briefly about the interpreters. Once again, go run and buy George Flores' next book. A couple of chapters, wonderful, on interpreters, learning languages, and so on, in Goa. Amazing. And after this brief commercial ad, in Maluku, we have some people, very interestingly, at the very beginning, they are referred as Nahuatacos. I remember the first time I came across this term, it was like, what the hell is this? And it took me a while to realize that this term refers to the indigenous population with a certain linguistic skill to act as translators in the Americas. And we know the names. We know some lineages like the Limas. And they are a very interesting example of this social mobility, because at a certain moment in this framework of late 16th century, two of these members of this family, a father and a son, got an appointment as captains of the fortress with the condition that the Sultan of Ternate, who is his friend, their friend, accept to return the fortress. The Sultan never accepted that. So you can see that this human capital and cultural capital and these factors being able to act as translator push their career in the Portuguese side and also in the Ternatan side, but to a lesser extent. You can see a difference, that at least in this case. It's a case that was studied by Antonio Lobato in a chapter on these mediators and translators, very interesting one, the most complete work we have for Maluku.
Puedo hacer
I just had a question about social promotion. This is the question you had. This is well related. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, so actually when this guy is nominated as a supervisor of the Japanese community in Hoi An in the Vietnamese port, this is a kind of social promotion actually. So this is the example I would have.
Unas cositas. Sí, una cosa que me sorprendió globalmente en las tres ponencias, si hacemos un poco de historia comparada, sería el amateurismo de los españoles, ¿no? Que parecen muy malos en hacer diplomacia. Y me preguntaba si no era por la naturaleza de las personas que hacen esta diplomacia, en vuestros dos casos, misioneros y en tu caso, José Miguel, eran soldados o oficiales, ¿no? Personas que tenían el poder de hacer lo que hacían, y creo que eran estas personas más legítimas que lo hacían lo más mal, ¿no? Muy mal, lo peor, lo hacían mal, no sé. Enfin, en tu caso parece muy exagerado, ¿no? De venir con este sentimiento de superioridad, etcétera. No sé, es una para el debate, porque pienso en otros casos, en lo de los Molucas, recuerdo que Andrés de Urdaneta, no sé, lo he leído así en artículos. Andrés de Urdaneta es un marinero, principios del siglo XVI, y viaja en uno de esos viajes españoles a las Islas Molucas, y dicen que tiene un papel diplomático para los españoles con las potencias locales, y entre potencias locales sabemos que tuvo una hija de una señora local también, no sé, un nivel, incluso ganó competencias lingüísticas, ¿no? Bueno, no sé si es una leyenda o no, pero podrás contestar. Y él es un marinero, no tiene un papel oficial así como los demás. Y creo que podemos añadir más ejemplos de esta gente que no tiene un papel oficial fuerte, pero tiene más capacidad de, más, como decir, fluideza o acomodación, no sé, hay estos velos, en Camboya hay un ejemplo, el portugués, me imagino que sabes esto, Pierre-Emmanuel. Bueno, era más un poco para comparar, porque en tu caso, Pierre-Emmanuel, ¿me entiendes, verdad? ¿Tu me comprends? Bueno.
Your Spanish is understandable for me.
Gracias, es un complemento, pero es que sí, normalmente hablo como un andaluz, pero para ti hablo como un francés, ¿no? Y sí, bueno, era eso porque en el caso de Pierre-Emmanuel hay pues parece funcionar bastante bien, aunque hay errores que entre el norte y el sur de Vietnam, pues hay uno que lo consigue y el otro no, no es totalmente fluido. Tampoco. Bueno, eso era más mi opinión general y luego tenía dos preguntitas. Si hay tiempo, Alexandre. ¿Estamos?
Sí.
Ok. Era más, es un comentario para Ana. Para 1579 creo que, no sé, el contexto es muy temprano, ¿no? Porque, por ejemplo, incluso el término de sanglé a este momento es muy reciente, etcétera, etcétera. Y por eso es interesante, creo, que escogen este intérprete sin saber, me imagino, acaban de llegar, comentabas, y toman a alguien, no sé, que imaginan que va a suceder, ¿no? Por el tema del idioma, no sabemos si habla cantonés o lo dijiste, ¿no? O Minan, bueno. Y también, bueno, es muy hipotético, pero si toman, y luego encuentran intérpretes acá, ¿no? En Cantón, y me imagino que un chino de Cantón que habla portugués, que sería el idioma para intercambiar conversaciones, está cercano, próximo a los portugueses que no tienen interés a ayudar a un español, ¿no? Y tal vez que la traición, no sé, hay este punto de Macao y los portugueses también, que no quieren ver a esta gente. Eso es puntual y por eso yo, si me permites, yo pienso que sería interesante comparar con otras expediciones de este tipo y sabes que hay 3-4 en 3-4 años, así que podrías tener aún más, comparar situaciones diversas y comparables, porque es muy comparable. Y bueno, era más así una pregunta, comentario. Y para Pierre-Emmanuel, no entendí muy bien quién fue Úrsula, lo siento, pero es una mujer japonesa que vive... O coreana. Que vive en Vietnam y que es l'intermédiaire. Eso, ¿no? Y do we have more details on her, or it's all you said? It's what we know about her.
I say most of it.
Okay.
That is the Dutch arrived in.
We have to be disciplined.
Sorry. So yes, this is pretty much all what I say was pretty much it. When the Dutch arrived in present-day northern Vietnam, they met a Japanese interpreter, and after that they said he wrote to an interpreter in Hanoi. It's not Hanoi, but this is the present-day Hanoi, and she's Ursula, and she's going to help you, and she helps. This is all we have about her. Unfortunately, we have. There is a debate, a very specific debate in Japanese scholarship, to know if there is another Ursula, and to know if she's this Ursula or not. And because we have another very important Japanese trader in Hanoi, and her wife is named Ursula. And he works with the Jesuits, he works with the Dutch, and he also works with the missionaries from the Mission Étrangère de Paris when they arrived in the 1660s. So he's very important, and he was married to an Ursula. But we don't have many information about her. And a very famous Japanese historian thought that it was two different Ursula. So if this is two different Ursula, we just have what is inside the journals of the Dutch, which is just someone very close to the highest authorities who could speak Japanese, Vietnamese, Portuguese, because she was in connection with the missionaries, and she was named Ursula, so she was probably a Christian convert. So this is the only thing we can infer from the information we have. And she was really respected, but this is pretty frequent in Southeast Asia to have women in diplomatic/trading relationships seen as very legitimate, with a high-ranking position, etc. So this is this kind of things, but yeah, we don't know much more.
Y yo por mi parte, muchas gracias Guillaume por los comentarios. Sí, por supuesto, cuando los castellanos o los españoles están allí, no están para nada preparados y tampoco lo estarán en el siglo siguiente. Yo he trabajado más en el 17 y me interesaba esta embajada para analizar el caso de mediación lingüística, pero no se da cuenta de que es que jamás los tuvieron preparados para hacer frente a ello. Es decir, que en el 17 los que acaban haciendo las embajadas comerciales y políticas son los religiosos, que los ponen a la cabeza de todos los contactos que se cuando, por ejemplo, en mediados del 17, China, que ya está bajo el dominio de la familia de los Cheng, cierran comercio con Filipinas, el gobernador manda una embajada en la que pone a comerciantes, pero al frente pone a los religiosos, y además les avisa de que al llegar a China, a Fujian, tienen que contactar con el dominico que está allí solo para que los introduzca. Es decir, que realmente no se dotaron nunca, tampoco había, supongo, la gente suficiente para articularlo. Y lo otro que... Las rivalidades, por supuesto que las habría, es decir, lo que me comentabas de portugueses y castellanos, incluso, bueno, a pesar del periodo de unión, pues bueno, allí estaban peleándose todos, ¿no? Y la otra cosa que iba a comentar, que se me ha ido del santo al cielo. Sí, bueno, la idea que también ha salido en las tres comunicaciones, ¿no? La idea de los contactos diplomáticos, o lo que nosotros ahora entendemos por diplomacia, en un contexto en que no existía, en que realmente se hacía pues mediante estos, no sé, el compañero lo ha articulado muy bien en la presentación, ¿no? La propia legitimación, el uso de los regalos, ¿no? Intentando cubrir todas esas cosas que en el caso de China y Manila queda muy claro el papel de los religiosos. Y ya sé lo que iba a decir. El cambio de lo que he analizado yo entre esta embajada franciscana del 16 y lo que pasará en el 17 es que, si bien en el 16 es verdad, y lo apuntabas muy bien tú, que en los primeros momentos el aprendizaje de la lengua china era muy poquito, es decir, habían empezado, en el 17, a pesar de que seguirán utilizando a intérpretes, a mediadores chinos, es verdad que el conocimiento que tenían algunos religiosos debería ser, porque nuevamente ahora aquí la parte sensorial que comentaba el compañero, no tenemos datos, pero un ejemplo muy claro, que Coxinga eligiera como emisario a un religioso, es que este religioso debía tener algún tipo de competencia lingüística suficiente. No sabemos si llegaron a hablar o no, es decir, no lo conocemos, pero alguna competencia tendría que tener.
Sí, pero
¿no?
a mí siempre me ha llamado la atención cómo de competentes lingüísticos eran los religiosos. Porque, por ejemplo, los jesuitas siempre se las daban de que sabían, eran los más competentes. Y luego nos encontramos casos, de hecho aquí hemos hablado poco del Islam, de por ejemplo la presencia del Islam en el sudeste, pero claro, allí los jesuitas llegaron y algunos de ellos hablaban tan mal las lenguas, por ejemplo el caso de Francisco Combés, que fue un individuo bien interesante que se acabó convirtiendo en un diplomático en la corte de Corralat. Este señor escribió una carta en Bisaya tan mal que acabaron matando a sus compañeros Alejandro López y Juan de Montiel, precisamente porque, parece ser, escribió o hizo una mala traducción y porque no respetó los protocolos de los que estamos hablando aquí, ¿no? De regalos, Yo creo que es interesante también porque a veces, claro, Por eso decía antes la cuestión etnográfica. Se supone que los misioneros conocen el terreno, pero a veces yo me pregunto cómo lo conocen de bien, ¿no?
Claro, también ahí la reflexión me lleva, Alex, es decir, es verdad el tema de la verdad, es decir, no sabemos exactamente, ¿no? Pero sí que hay cosas, por ejemplo, en el 17, Navarrete, en los tratados, él introduce una parte relativa a la descripción, por ejemplo, de caracteres chinos que ha tenido que coger directamente del diccionario chino, que en ese momento era el que se utilizaba. La otra cosa es que creo que, y hay trabajos que ya enfatizan en esto, ¿no? Que seguramente desde la perspectiva nuestra hablamos siempre de trabajos muy individuales y eran trabajos colectivos. Es decir, seguramente cuando Navarrete cogió este diccionario necesitó 2, 3, 4 chinos, porque además, y en esto tuve la suerte que me ayudó un compañero que ha trabajado en esta casa, Manu Moreno, que conoce chino clásico, entonces resiguiendo, y Navarrete hace un uso del diccionario a pies juntillas, es decir, pero esto demuestra que él conocía o que hizo un trabajo de equipo, es decir, porque luego le explica, es decir, traduce y explica los...
Bueno, es el caso de Cobo y Benavides,
exacto,
por ejemplo, ¿no? Que trabajaron en el Parián y
entonces,
fueron...
Exacto, yo creo que sí que hubo algunos que seguramente adquirirían algunas competencias, no sé si para ir solos, pero sí para manejarse. Seguramente, y es verdad que ahí pues los jesuitas se las dan siempre, y también los dominicos y agustinos y los mendicantes, seguramente fueron pocos. Y ahí es, yo creo, el matiz que hay que introducir, que los pocos que llegaron a dominar la lengua, bueno, pues no fueron tantos como los que las historias de las órdenes religiosas han querido mostrar. Esa es mi percepción también, un poco en la línea de lo que comenta Alex.
Sobre el amateurismo, ¿no? Y esto yo creo que va a ser una de las futuras líneas de investigación en la historia diplomática, ¿no? No, porque hasta ahora hemos estado demasiado fascinados por estas historias de éxito o lo buenos que eran aprendiendo y demás, y ahora, como decía Alex, somos cada vez más conscientes de sus limitaciones, lo cual hace su trabajo todavía más interesante. Yo no soy la persona para defender la actuación de los españoles en el sudeste asiático, pero Guillaume, te agradezco el comentario, porque me permite refinar un poco más algo de lo que he presentado. Sí, tenemos ejemplos de españoles que se adaptaron muy bien. El ejemplo de Urdaneta es uno muy bueno. Hablabas de las competencias lingüísticas, aprende algunas cosas, consigue una cosa, él y otros, ¿no? En trabajo colectivo, todavía más difícil, y es que consigue que las élites malucas aprendan euskera. Hay dos cronistas portugueses distintos que hablan de que los ternates meten algunas palabras vizcaínas. Claro, tiene sentido. El tema es que Urdaneta y estos primeros marinos están mucho tiempo allí, están mucho tiempo. Y eso es lo que marca la diferencia. En los años 80, en los años 70 y 80, tenemos algunos ejemplos también de españoles que son muy hábiles allí. Por ejemplo, una cosa que es representativa, eso está en el relato del primer viaje de Drake. Cuando él llega a las Molucas, se encuentra aquí un español residiendo en la corte de Ternate. Y años después, cuando la Inquisición apretara las tuercas a uno de sus compañeros de viaje en Lima, este inglés iba a confesar una cosa interesante, ¿no? Y es que en Ternate les recibe bien porque los toman por españoles. Hubo una época en la que los españoles eran como los buenos de esa película. Había este recuerdo de esta presencia prolongada, había esta noción de eran diferentes a los portugueses que habían pasado a ser los malos, pero porque había gente que había aprendido. Hay un caso, que es un caso muy interesante, es Rojo de Brito, que es conocido porque es el que hace el primer relato etnográfico y geográfico de lo que hoy es Papúa Nueva Guinea. Yo creo que es un portugués lusoasiático, pero que está mucho tiempo en Manila y que ha entendido perfectamente cómo funciona esta diplomacia de baja intensidad comunitaria en Ternate. Prueba de ello es que las autoridades de Manila le enganchan porque se ha aliado con el factor o el contador de los almacenes reales y ha montado una red de tráfico de artillería a cambio de especias. Es sabe cómo, pero la diferencia es eso, es gente que ha estado mucho tiempo allí. El problema de la diplomacia española es que está en manos de gente que son recién llegados. Que no es un problema solo de los españoles, a los portugueses también les pasa. Los portugueses son especialmente hábiles en esta diplomacia comunitaria, con Diego da Zambuja y demás, porque por una serie de catastróficas desdichas, su tiempo como capitán en Ternate, que tendría que durar 3 años, que es lo que está estipulado que pueden estar en sus puestos los portugueses, dura 8. Y ahí es cuando ves que verdaderamente han conseguido entrar y han sido verdaderamente hábiles. Y de hecho, pues desarrollan incluso su propia diplomacia en contra de otros portugueses y en contra de los españoles. Pero sí, no, hay un amateurismo, ¿no? El punto es el tiempo que han podido estar allí, el conocimiento, pero esto es problemático porque esto nos pone en esta idea de que hay como unos procesos de acumulación del conocimiento a lo largo del tiempo en estos imperios ibéricos. Y lo que yo veo, y no soy el único, pero es que no siempre es así, no es una acumulación lineal, va mucho en función de los equipos y las redes personales. Hay gobernadores en Filipinas que se han sabido rodear de gente que entiende de esto, hay virreyes en México a los que les podemos intuir un conocimiento del auténtico laberinto, políticamente hablando, que es el sudeste asiático. Se han rodeado de marinos, se han rodeado de gente que ha estado allí y hay gente que no. El problema es que muchas veces la autoridad diplomática está en gente que carece de ese conocimiento. Y luego también hay una cuestión, es que lo hacen tan mal que cuesta creer que lo hicieran tan mal. ¿No es parte de esto una interferencia que hay en la comunicación, en la comunicación política, que son las fuentes que nos llegan a nosotros, ¿no? Esta idea de vamos a conquistar esto, tal, ¿no es esta idea que muchas veces se espera que un gobernador vaya a tener y que por tanto da? No lo sé. En esto tú eres el experto en la comunicación política, así que no me aventuro a entrar por ahí. Pero de nuevo, muchas gracias por tu punto, que me permite refinar algunas de las cuestiones que había puesto encima de la mesa.
Yo estaba tentado a hacer un comentario, pero yo no sé si, porque por el tiempo. Lo que pasa es que a mí esto del amateurismo es que es con los diplomáticos, pero también hasta con los religiosos, porque claro, al final, por ejemplo, ¿qué quiere decir un religioso misionero? ¿No? ¿Es un hombre que tiene vocación? ¿O es una persona que...? Porque hay casos, por ejemplo, antes mencionaba a Combés. Este señor estuvo en Molucas, precisamente, en el socorro que iba de Manila a Molucas. Y este señor se convirtió en algo así como en un diplomático también, porque tenía contactos y porque iba regularmente. Y este señor leía Botero, leía La razón de Estado de Botero, y acabó convirtiéndose en un auténtico personaje que escribió textos fundamentales para la política de Manila, de Filipinas, pero que en realidad no era esa su vocación, en teoría, porque este señor entró a la compañía con 16 años y se acabó convirtiendo, lo que decimos, ¿no? La experiencia de la vida te lleva a casos a veces sorprendentes, ¿no? El caso de Molucas, yo conozco a algunos soldados que se acabaron convirtiendo en religiosos y acabaron de canónigos en la Catedral de Manila. Hay casos de estos también. Soldados que para escapar de Molucas, porque no era fácil escaparse de allí, se acabaron convirtiendo en sacerdotes y algunos de ellos llegaron a colaborar con los gobernadores de Filipinas, por ejemplo con Fajardo. Te puedo dar el dato muy interesante porque algunas de estas vidas realmente merecen una biografía de esos personajes que también se podrían acabar en esa especie de diplomáticos de baja intensidad, ¿no? Pero que tuvieron un recorrido que es de novela o de serie de Netflix, ¿no? Porque realmente es impresionante cómo la vida de estos personajes va de soldados de fortuna, acaban de religiosos y luego regresan al lugar de donde vinieron como algo así como diplomáticos, ¿no? Entonces, claro, es muy interesante también ver qué tipo de amateurismo, porque claro, es que hay de muchos tipos y no afecta solo a las personas, por ejemplo, en este caso a soldados. Yo creo que es muy amplio, ¿no? Personas que se acaban dedicando a lo que pueden para buscarse la vida, ¿no?
Y eso rompe con cualquier concepción así mecanicismo.
Sí, por eso digo, sí, totalmente.
Súper interesante. Yo conocía casos distintos, casos de jesuitas que en algún momento empuñan las armas.
También,
y en algunos incluso que se gustan contando cómo se han convertido en estos...
No, pero si te interesa, hay un dato, yo conozco un par que fueron exsoldados de Molucas que de hecho se acabaron incluso defendiendo, ellos empuñando las armas contra algunos holandeses cuando habían las invasiones, bueno, los cercos de la bahía de Manila, y habían sido exsoldados, y de hecho la experiencia como exmilitares les permitió incluso pues, participar activamente, ¿no? Y claro, eso es sorprendente porque eran canónigos, ¿no? Yo lo sabía de jesuitas.
Sí, no, y además una cuestión, voy a abrir esto más allá de las Molucas, pero una cuestión que toca con lo que está contando Alex, que toca con grandes temas interesantes, es que a las Molucas quienes van de soldados son lo peor de lo peor, ¿no? Esto lo ha estudiado muy bien Stephanie Mawson. Los gobernadores de Filipinas se quejan constantemente de es que nos mandan presidiarios y los desechos de Nueva España, pero es que a ellos les falta tiempo para mandarlos a las Molucas, y por eso estas carreras nos hablan de un ascenso social que hubiera sido imposible en cualquier otro medio. Ojo, el ascenso social siempre está asociado con estas nociones muy calcular, no, es más una cuestión de supervivencia y aprovechar estos espacios que se van abriendo. Y también porque esto conecta con esta idea de, bueno, es que esta diplomacia muchas veces es negociar quiénes somos y qué es esta comunidad. Somos combatientes, no somos no combatientes. Somos religiosos, no somos actores religiosos. Es por eso por lo que celebro mucho el que hayáis puesto esto en el centro del debate hoy.
Bueno, pues ya, no sé si hay alguna otra pregunta. Yo tengo una pequeña presentación, pero voy a ser breve porque tampoco querría, en fin, nos podríamos... Entonces, bueno, pues voy a presentar, a ver si consigo no estropear nada. A ver, porque esto es un poco...
¿Hay agua?
Sí. A ver. No lo he hecho bien aquí. Vale, pues esta es la... I can do it in English if you want, or English is fine. Okay. No, I'm going to be brief, and thank you very much for your patience. This is the book that Fabian Fechner and I are now about to publish in Brill. And this deals with, as you can see, with Jesuits, procurators in this globalizing world. And this is a very ambitious book that we were planning basically
Sorry. You're sharing a different screen.
Oh.
You're sharing a calendar instead of your PowerPoint.
This one?
Okay.
Eh,
Yo creo que está viendo tu calendario.
Ah.
¿No?
Sí.
Estás viendo.
Cancela la fotografía global.
Aquí, a ver.
Deja de presentar y ahora cambias.
A ver, dejo de presentar.
Sí, a vegades se enganxa i és mejor.
Se engancha. Entonces, a ver. Aquí debe ser esto, ¿no?
No, deja aquí.
Deixo de compartir. I ara vaig a veure...
La pestanya de dalt, no, la pestanya de dalt.
Aquesta? Aquesta, sí.
Ara aquí vas i dius aquí. I ara li dius finestra.
Finestra.
I la del vídeo, aquí.
Okay, can you see that now? Yep.
Ahora sí.
Okay. So now I was saying that this is a book project that we were planning. I don't know, I think it dates back to 2000 and about 4 years ago. We were planning to publish a book on this globalizing world, but focus on the Jesuit procurators, because we thought that even though we had some articles, out there, we were in need of a monograph that should explain the importance of these actors in a sense that that should be in a comparative way. We were not interested in focusing on Latin America or in Asia. We were thinking of a global book that might explain to what extent these mediators were actually questioning this idea about the verticality of the Society of Jesus. Sometimes we tend to think that the Jesuits were very much like thinking of a pyramid. I have some, well, in this sense that you can read here, that of course some of the aspects that we think when talking about the Jesuit procurators, we already talk about that. I mean, they were representatives of their own territories, appointed by the provincials. We were very interested in these particular procurators, because when we talk about the procurator as a term, this is very ambiguous. I mean, procurator means many things. Some kind of person who works in Acapulco gathering people to be sent to the Philippines, they are procurators as well. I mean, procurators were sometimes economic agents, but we were not interested in these ones. We were interested in those who were elected, the ones who were elected in the congregations, in the provincial congregations of each territory of the Jesuit world. So these procurators were, and I'm using some metaphor by Fabian, and these living letters, because of course when you think about the procurators and you think that they were actually in touch with the general, being sent to the courts of Rome and Madrid, they were providing information to the general. And this was very delicate, because when you think about letters, they didn't write much. In fact, most of the communication between the generals and these provincial procurators were oral communication. They were talking to them rather than writing, because this was very delicate to write about things that more often than not were controversial. So we were interested in analyzing these issues in terms of what Krusinski defined as cultural mediators. They were certainly cultural mediators, but we were also interested in this moment in which they were being sent. Of course, they had many issues in mind. I mean, not only sending information to the general, but also they were taking care of many businesses. Some elites of these provinces were asking them to buy, for instance, things, buying books or bringing relics with them, or any kind of concern that they might have. They were taking advantage of those people who were going to the courts and of course to be in touch with relatives, or and of course they were agents. They were political agents, and this is very interesting, the way how most of these guys that were appointed. I was very struck by the thing that most of them were missionaries. I mean. And this is the thing, we were comparing and contrasting different areas, and we found that most of them were, they were in pairs, like the apostles. I mean, first they were sent just one, but then they decided, the generals, by the end of the 16th century, it was decided to send 2 procurators, and many times they did not agree to each other. I mean, they sent like a professed father, and the other one was coadjutor brother. And sometimes they didn't agree, because that was what they wanted to do, to provoke some kind of disagreement, not send people that all agreed with some issues. So the thing is, they did this on purpose. And this is very fascinating because, of course, the election was political. I mean, we were analyzing also the way in which these procurators were elected. This is the famous family tree by Athanasius Kirchner. This is the idea about the tree, the Jesuit tree, with branches, and these branches are representative of the Society of Jesus itself. But the idea that, I mean, I certainly love this metaphor about how you can understand the idea about globality when we look at this tree, because this was exactly the purpose of the Jesuits, to spread all over the world, and they were pretty much successful. But the thing about all these Jesuits that you can find and were elected, because they were sent to discuss with the general, but also there was a congregation of procurators that was convened every 3 years. So we can find also very interesting issues, like, for instance, when some different procurators coincided in Rome one year. That happened with Diego de Torres, the procurator in Paraguay, and with Pedro Quirino. This was the procurator of the Philippines. They both coincided in 1604 in Rome. And of course, I can imagine how impressive it was to get so much information from different places at the same time, without internet, without all what we have nowadays, and keeping informed about what's going on in the world. This was because of this system that was very effective, and well, this is kind of scary. You see all these faces, the assistant and the general. But I love also this outline you can find here about how this was organized. I mean, the idea about the provincial, that had chairs and organizing the congregations, and how this was made for providing all this effective information to the general. So the general could be informed about all the issues that were taking place in this world. What we I think that one of the main aspects of the book is what I said at the very beginning, that we should start questioning this idea about verticality, about thinking that the Jesuits were like a pyramid, that everything was decided from in a top-down perspective. I think when you compare and look at the problems that these procurators were bringing to the court, we certainly think that not all the legislation was followed. We can see that most of the issues that these procurators were saying to the general is that most of the concerns, I mean, the local aspect, we are also fascinated by this local perspective that these procurators were providing to the general. I mean, one thing is what you should, as a Jesuit, do in practice, in theory, and in practice was totally different. Because these local congregations had so much power that sometimes they could work independently from what the general was saying. And this is something that happened when you compare these different places. So in fact, we are also concerned about what Guillermo Wilde said, for instance, about missionary knowledge, and how important was this for understanding the way how these missionaries were playing a role, I think, in this administrative history of the Society of Jesus. I mean, not only aspects that you guys were mentioning, I mean, all these issues about the diplomatic gift-giving economy, which is very fascinating when you think and compare different spaces in different overseas territories, but also how decisions were made. I think this is also very interesting. Marcus Friedrich has written extensively about this, and the decision making is one of the most important issues that I think we should scrutinize when dealing with the Society of Jesus, because again, I think these congregations, these provincial congregations, demonstrates precisely that the local territories, overseas territories, had so much power, and they were pretty much autonomous. And of course, all these missionaries that were sent to Rome, they had an agenda. They had their own agenda. Sometimes, for instance, when Pedro Quirino was sent to Rome, well, he had in mind the division of the Philippines, to turn the Philippines into a Jesuit province independently from Mexico. But also all these conflicts that the Jesuits had with other religious orders. I mean, we can find so much information about this. Information that then we can follow with other written sources. And of course we can see how important these procurators were when being sent to the court, because sometimes they stayed. I mean, theoretically speaking, they were appointed for 6 years, except in Mexico, where they were appointed only three years. But sometimes they stayed. They didn't want to return, and sometimes. Well, they were very influential, and that's the strategy that some Jesuit provincials were following, about sending these very important subjects, because most of them, right after being appointed as procurators, they became provincials of the society of their territories, which means that they were not sending someone without experience. I mean, rather the contrary. They were very experienced men, missionaries or scholars. But I was very impressed by how influential they were in many ways. I mean, taking care of recruiting missionaries, sometimes following the canonization of these martyrs who died in different places, or the publication of Jesuit histories for propaganda. We know that was also something that they were very into. I mean, so they had many tasks to develop, but in the end, when we think overall about these, I would say, diplomats, because they were actually acting as diplomats, I think what really makes, I hope, this book important is that it provides a different perspective, not vertical but much more horizontal, about the Society of Jesus, that we can find now, and of course, I think they deserve much more analysis that they had. I mean, sometimes we were analyzing these procurators in a very individual way. Like we were interested in these procurators because they were sent to this place. But I think when you analyze them in a global perspective, you think that they were playing a role that sometimes we did not pay attention sufficiently. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I'm going to skip the procurators of the Mariana Islands because that's a way how you could, read the book. But the thing is, most of them, as I said, where, for instance, in this case, Luis de Morales, he was a missionary, he was a procurator, and in the end, he became the provincial of the Philippines. And this was not an exception. I mean, many others were appointed as provincials. In fact, they were appointed provincials before being sent to Spain. And sometimes when they realized that they were appointed provincials, they were very honored, but this was something that they were expecting, because that was, I mean, procurator was, I think there was a provincial, director, and the procurator was probably one of the highest honor that a Jesuit might deserve. And that's it. So thank you very much for the patience. Por supuesto.
Muy interesante. No, pensaba dos cosas que me han sugerido que has comentado. Una que me ha sorprendido, la que comentabas que eran negociaciones orales más que escritas. Entonces esto me ha sorprendido. Yo no conozco el caso de los procuradores jesuitas, pero en cambio sigue trabajando los últimos años Santa María Caballero y también con Marina, que hemos trabajado Buenaventura Ibáñez, Marina Torres, sí que ahí hay una parte muy importante de escrito. Entonces me ha sorprendido y cuando después de la oralidad hay un punto en que esos procuradores tienen también que ejercer, ¿no? ¿Cómo lo...?
Bueno, porque,
¿hay trazabilidad o no?
Sí, porque en realidad, a ver, es que habían temas que eran muy difíciles temas que no se podían escribir, ¿no? Por ejemplo, todo el tema del siglo XVII, el antijesuitismo, por ejemplo, flagrante que hay en Filipinas, ¿no? Estoy pensando en el arzobispo Felipe Pardo, el jansenismo, claro, todos esos conflictos que hay precisamente con los dominicos, ¿no? Porque Felipe Pardo era dominico. Estoy hablando de peleas a tumba abierta. Entonces, claro, esto no se escribía.
Pero luego lo puedes seguir con otros documentos.
Claro, exactamente. Luego tú ves los documentos que los mismos dominicos o los jesuitas publican. Entonces tú entiendes que muy probablemente, bueno, y que incluso estos mismos procuradores publican, porque estos son enviados allí para defender las posturas de la compañía en frente de algunos, digamos, jansenistas, como, es decir, porque esto también existía en Filipinas, ¿no? Un antijesuitismo ya a finales del XVII. Entonces, claro, yo creo que esto tiene que ver con la delicadeza del asunto, pero esto era común. Yo no creo que fuera exclusivo de los jesuitas, ni mucho menos. Hay cosas que no se escribían. Conflictos, problemas también de todo tipo. Entonces, claro, esto de leading letters, pues claro, es una forma de decir que en realidad el procurador era la carta que se mostraba ante digamos, el general o también ante el rey, porque claro, también se entrevistaban con altos cargos de la corte para poder expresar o defender sus posturas, ¿no? Entonces sí, yo creo que esta era la cuestión, es decir, no dejar huella.
Sí, y la otra cosa que también me ha interesado, ¿no? Cómo esa agenda que comentabas individual, que la tenían cada uno de ellos, ¿no? Cómo también al final los lleva a jugar, ¿no? con el papado y con las diferentes monarquías, ¿no? Y el trato ese también es interesantísimo, porque al final es una historia paralela, ¿no? En el caso de, pues, me remito nuevamente, ¿no? Los franciscanos lo hacen y me parece, seguro que lo harían, ¿no? Entonces me parece muy interesante esta parte.
Hay una historia fascinante en el libro de la historia de las Marianas que publicó Le Gaudin en 1700, ¿no? en París. Se publicó en París básicamente porque Luis XIV era el rey defensor de las misiones en Asia, y también porque el que tenía que escribir esta obra, que era Francisco García, se murió en 1685, con lo cual los jesuitas se quedaron sin historiador. Y entonces cuando llega Luis de Morales como procurador a España, pues claro, se pregunta, bueno, y ahora, primero había que escribir una historia de las Marianas, en parte para canonizar a San Vítores, que fue el mártir de las Islas Marianas, pero se quedaron sin historiador. Entonces, ¿dónde fue esa historia al final? La acabó escribiendo un tal Charles de Gaudin, que nunca había puesto sus pies en Marianas, ¿no? Paradójicamente. Pero claro, ahí estaba la estrategia, ¿no? La estrategia de plantear que los jesuitas eran capaces de estar en unas islas donde no había nada. ni oro ni plata ni nada. Entonces, claro, eso tenía que ver también con todo el problema del antijesuitismo, es decir, era una obra claramente de propaganda. Es que nosotros podemos ir a islas como estas, ¿no? Cuando había toda la crítica de que la compañía estaba más interesada en lo económico que en lo espiritual. Bueno, pues el libro este, de la historia de las Marianas, fue el libro clave para defender precisamente lo contrario a lo que se acusaba a la compañía. Y precisamente este fue un cometido de un procurador, que fue Luis de Morales, que había sido compañero de San Vitores y misionero en las Islas Marianas. Entonces, claro, esto es un tema además muy interesante desde la perspectiva historiográfica, ¿no? Porque él hacía de diplomático también, ¿no? Porque, claro, estos individuos que son enviados allí, ¿qué hacen? Bueno, se entrevistan con todo tipo de personajes, ¿no? Es decir, pero bueno, estoy pensando, por ejemplo, en la duquesa de Aveiro, ¿no? La duquesa de Aveiro, que fue una de las madres de las misiones, esta señora fue la que promocionó las misiones de Quino, de Eusebio Quino en la Nueva España, y hay casos, ¿no?, que sabemos de algunos de estos procuradores que le escribían cartas a la duquesa de Aveiro desde el galeón, o sea, ya antes incluso de desembarcar en Sevilla, y eso es desde el galeón, ¿no? Porque claro, ellos tenían clarísimo que estas eran personalidades importantísimas con las que se entrevistaban. Entonces, claro, yo veo ahí, pues lógicamente, un tema, ¿no?, de diplomacia fundamental, ¿no?
Bueno, y lo último, porque es lo primero que quería haber dicho, enhorabuena por el libro y gracias por la presentación.